this video, we approach the last 9 encounters in the Western United States Dogman Encounter series. We look at encounters from Colorado, Oregon, California, and even Arizona. Enjoy this 3rd installment and get ready to be spooked. Story 1. Well, I'm 24 years old, male, and live in the middle of nowhere. Literally. I will be short and simple about my encounter. I was getting home late one day after dropping my sister off at the airport in Lamar, Colorado. I live just under 7 miles north of the Oklahoma border on a roughly 250 acres of land. I have a trap line running around my property for coyotes. The first 2 traps I checked were empty, so I headed south. That's when I saw this thing. Now, at first, I thought it was a coyote, just a really big coyote. It was almost 5 feet tall and on all 4s. It was caught in my trap and was running around, making a dust cloud. And then it stopped and looked right at me. Now, I use a Duke No. 3 leg hold trap, so I can catch a variety of things in it. Anyway, I slammed on the brakes and my truck stalled. Because it's a manual, I was fumbling for the keys to start it. It's an old farm truck with a carburetor on it, and it had quite an afterfire. Once it heard that, it lunged at me and roared. I saw that it had its hand, not paw, but an actual hand, caught in my trap. Well, the right hand to be exact. It had been probably looking for the dead rabbit I had in the bait hole next to the trap. It then stood up and ripped the 2 earth anchors I had 24 inches in the ground right out. It took me a long time to put them in with a 10-pound hammer, but it pulled them straight out like it was nothing in just 15 seconds. After it did that, it just stood there, looking at me. It felt like an eternity, and I knew my .357 Magnum would do nothing to stop this thing if it came at me. I prayed to God Almighty that it wouldn't come for me in my truck. I was looking at it in shock and awe, and noticed that it had orange amber eyes. They weren't glowing. Instead, they had a tint, like a cat's eyes in the dark. They may have been reflecting my headlights. I can't be too sure. It then took a step towards me, curled its upper lip, showing me its teeth. They were humongous. The longest 2 had to have been 4 to 5 inches long easily. It then growled at me, and then it was gone in the blink of an eye. I was scared shitless then. I jammed the truck into gear and spun the tires, getting out of Dodge. Like I said earlier, it seemed like an eternity, but it must have lasted no more than 30 seconds at max. I later returned with an Indian friend of mine. I grew up with him and trusted him. He told me some stories that were passed down through his grandparents' tribe and mentioned something about a loup-garou, or the French werewolf. He also told me how fur trappers in the late 1700s to 1800s were chased off the land in the Rockies from this creature. Story 2. On August 27, 2016, my 10-year-old grandson was sitting in a car at a restaurant parking lot waiting for his paternal grandmother. Across the street from him, on a sidewalk, he noticed a large creature, which I determined to be 7 to 8 feet tall from talking with him. It was walking on 2 legs towards a wooded area at the end of a sidewalk and disappeared into some brush. The creature did not appear concerned about my grandson, as it was in no hurry. When I asked him about what he had seen, he described a classic canine-type dogman with red eyes. His distance from the creature was approximately 30 feet. Daly City is a semi-rural with many pockets of woodlands and some tracts of forest. The area where he saw the creature has paved roads and sidewalks, ringed with areas of trees. Story 3. 1953. The encounter I'd like to share is not my own, but that of my mother. She used to tell me stories when I was young about strange things she had experienced in her lifetime. I remembered this Dogman type of encounter while listening to many Dogman shows on YouTube. There's not particularly a lot of detail to this encounter, but what you might find interesting is the location. The sighting took place in Sacramento, California around 1953, not too far from our state's capital. Using Google Maps to get an approximate location and lay of the land, I could see the sighting area was about 1,000 feet to the west and of perpendicular to the American River. Across the river from the east bank, it's only about another 2,000 east to the state capital. So, this took place fairly close to a heavily populated area. My mother states that when she was about 12 years old, she was lying on the couch watching television. That's when she noticed a scary dog face looking at her through a low-pane window. The window was either on or by the door. I'm unclear on this fact. In any event, the head, she said, must have been about 2 to 2.5 feet above the ground. She covered her face in fright with her pillow. After a minute or so, she snuck a peek, figuring she must be imagining things. She saw it was gone and felt a little better. Then she noticed it was now looking through another higher window. Its head was now about 4 to 4.5 feet above the ground, according to her recollection. There was nothing outside that window for a dog to stand on, and at that point, she just ran to another room in terror. She doesn't really recall what happened after that. She describes the animal as being dark gray with glowing red eyes, seemingly panting or baring its teeth. She didn't see the body, but had the impression that it was thin. Unfortunately, she doesn't recall the time of day, month, or season. My parents tell me there's likely some American Indian burial grounds in the area, as there had been excavations near the river, which yielded Native American arrowheads and other artifacts. I even asked my mother if there were cornfields around the area, since that has to have been mentioned in past encounters. She said only the small patch of corn stalks in their own backyard. I don't think that qualifies. The area around my grandparents' house was not really wooded. The neighborhood was mostly just large fields with a few horses and some cattle. The area around the river is wooded now, though, and was probably a lot more so in 1953 than it is today. Another paranormal story about this area is that on Monster Quest episode detailing the Mothman, someone supposedly was taking dusk or night shot picture of the Tower Bridge in 2009 and happened to see a flying humanoid shape or something off of the bridge. Story 4. I was walking out on the Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park in the Stout Memorial Grove. It is approximately 1 mile in circumference. I was going to go to the left and circle around, but there were 2 young guys that started to walk off trail to a big tree, so I went to the right. 50 foot down the trail, I heard a loud roar mixed with 2 screams. Then, dead silence. I thought it was the 2 guys messing around, but I didn't hear any laughter after it. The hair on my arms stood up, wondering what it was. I turned around immediately to leave because it was getting late, around 8:40 or so, and the sun was starting to set. About 20 feet back down the trail, I noticed a black figure standing about 120 feet from where the 2 young guys were standing earlier. At first, I thought it was a bear standing up because it was roughly about 7 feet tall and backlit by the sun. The face was partially obscured by a branch, and it was too far away to smell. I took 2 quick pictures of it and left. I didn't realize what I had photographed until later on when I looked at them myself. Story 5. In October of 1972, my husband, our 2 babies, my brother, and I had left Leavenworth, Kansas, in our 1968 Volkswagen van on a camping trip to a recreational area in Arkansas called Beaver Lake. When we finally got there, we found a fairly remote campsite at the far end of the park. We wanted to be alone as the babies woke often during the night and needed to feed. We didn't want to disturb any other campers. Shortly after pulling into our campsite, my brother pitched his tent next to the van. The rest of us were going to sleep in the van. The campsite was in an area with a horseshoe-shaped, rocky terraced ledge that rose from 50 feet to around 100 feet as it curved around behind the 4 campsites. Because of mature trees and thick brush, daylight had trouble poking into our spot. Fast forward to that night. Sometime around 3:30 a.m., I heard some animal sounds on the ridge that I thought were being made by coyotes. The babies were asleep and all was quiet otherwise. I peered out the window but couldn't see what it was that was making sounds because it was so dark. Still hearing odd yips and howls, I had laid back down and on the back seat. Moments later, there was a huge crashing bang on the van wall right next to my head. My husband leapt up out of a full sleep. My brother bolted out of his tent and jumped into the van with us. We were all in panic, to say the least, looking in every direction trying to see what had hit the van like that. My brother finally yelled that he saw something moving behind the van. We all turned just in time to see a large shadow moving about 20 feet behind the van, from left to right. After about 20 minutes had passed, without any of us seeing movement out there, my husband and brother went out to inspect the van for damage, but found none. We then started hearing pounding steps coming from the brush about 50 feet behind us. The guys eased back into the front seat of the van, and that's when my husband turned on the headlights and stepped on the brake pedal for the rear light. Instantly, there was a huge commotion. He started the engine, and that's when, in the glow from the headlights, we could see a hairy thing 10 feet away and coming toward the van. As it got closer, its silver-tipped hairs glistened in the light. It had a grayish streak from its shoulders down to its back to its buttocks. The creature was walking on two legs and was around 7 to 8 feet tall, and it had a barrel chest and skinny legs. It never gave us a good view of its eyes, so I can't tell you what they look like. I could see that the face was not ape-like at all. It was very dog-like. Its ears had tufts of fur on top of them, and it was very human-like in its movements and general body structure. It moved smoothly and quickly around to the back of the van, where it followed the base of the ridge away from us. And that's when it let out a menacing huff and a low rumbling growl like a dog. Insanely, my husband and brother bolted from the van, trying to get a better look. That's when a shower of gravel came on us. My husband and brother tore back into the van and burned up the road, just getting us out of there. I kept looking in the back window, and they looked in the rearview mirrors, but none of us ever saw it again. It just didn't seem like a Sasquatch was what we had seen. It seemed too dog-like in its face and was too slim in its body. I still have PTSD-like feelings to this day, just from the encounter alone. Story 6. August was 17 years old at the time. My dad and mom had taken my little brother and sister to Tucson to do something for the day. We lived in a trailer in a rural area outside of Sierra Vista. We had 2 horses, 2 dogs, a cow, and chickens on the small amount of land we had. As the oldest son, it was my job to feed and take care of them. On the night in question, it was a stormy monsoon rain with thunder and lightning going on. But, like monsoons can be, they rage and then settle into a lull, and rage again. I was getting ready to settle down and watch a good movie, when all of a sudden, my 2 dogs started barking, and one shut up when I told him to calm down. In the previous week or so before that, my dogs had been acting up and barking a lot at night. I attributed this to coyotes that I heard howling in the night, so I got my dad's rifle and just 1 bullet, in case I had to shoot to scare off the coyote, or kill it if rabid. I rested the loaded rifle near the wall, by the back door, and turned on the floodlights outside the trailer. The rain had just stopped, so I looked out by the window near the front door and saw our 2 horses and cows staring, as if through the front door to the back door of the trailer, where the dogs were barking. I thought, maybe they're scared of the coyotes. So I grabbed the rifle and opened up the back door. As I was getting near the back door, I heard my dogs whimpering and crying. Now I was thinking, is it be a pack of coyotes? So I put a few bullets in my pocket, figuring I could load them if I didn't like what I saw. I opened the door, and the darndest thing happened. My 2 dogs beeline rushed past me to the center of the trailer and hunkered down in the kitchen. Mud is everywhere on the floor from their paws, and I'm pissed, because now I have to clean this up. So I closed the door and go to try to get my dogs out, but they wouldn't budge and squirmed out of my arms when I tried to grab them. They were terrified. Now, I was mad at the coyotes and grabbed the rifle to go run them off or kill them if I had to. The trailer sits on a foundation of blocks. The front and back doors are accessible by a set of small stairs. I'm 5'6", by the way. I opened the back door and was looking out in the darkness at that point. I was about to step out when I saw a set of eyes looking back at me out of the darkness. From the top of my head in the trailer to the ground is around 7+ feet or so, and here is a set of eyes looking at me level and square on. I'm like, darn coyote must be on the small gravel hill we used to pave the road, or it's a bird on a mesquite bush. But I was thinking to myself, that moonshine was awfully bad and rained hard. What kind of bird would hunker down on a mesquite bush, and why would a coyote be out in a downpour? So I'm raising my rifle and drawing a bead on the eyes, when lightning lights up the night. All of a sudden, the lightning illuminates the small gravel hill, and that's like 6 feet high, and the surrounding mesquite bushes. The light winks out as fast as it appeared from the lightning. There was nothing on the gravel hill, and no bird on any of the bushes. Then it dawned on me. Whatever it was very tall and was still staring at me. A sense of dread crept over me, and all of a sudden, as I realized that the rifle only had one measly bullet, and if I missed, there was no way I'd be able to reload before it was on me, I kept the gun pointed at it as I quickly closed the door. I locked the door, realizing this trailer would never withstand whatever it was out there if it attacked. I locked the front door and turned on all the lights in the house. I grabbed all the bullets, the 30-06 and the .22 rifle, and then got in the kitchen with the dogs, and I loaded each rifle fully on. I hugged my dogs, and I prayed that whatever it was went away and didn't attack. I stayed awake that whole night until my parents got back. My dad was furious that all the lights were on. My dad checked outside for supposed coyotes, but whatever it was gone, and I could only hope it was gone for good. Story 7. July 2nd, 2015. While scanning the valley floor for sheep a mile from my house, I noticed 2 loping figures. Initially, I thought the figures were coyotes, or maybe stray dogs, but as the 2 figures neared an old sunken vehicle, I realized that the things were about the size of the vehicle, nearly 8 feet in length. Now, no animal could be that big on the reservation. I watched the 2 figures until they disappeared into the woods across the valley. It was starting to get dark, but the moon was bright enough, so I walked without a light. As I walked down the mountain, I heard something yelling. It was like a howl or a yell. I started to hurry. Then, when I got to my house, I locked the door and spent the night listening to the strangest sounds I've ever heard. I'm sure it was a skinwalker or a werewolf or something. Story 8. Back in the early 80s, 4 of us decided to make a trip down to the Snake River, which was about 5 miles from the town we lived in. This was in eastern Oregon. Lots of sagebrush and hills. It was at the beginning of winter, so there was only a slight amount of snow on the ground. It was going to be a full moon that night, and we knew it would be a spectacular view of the river. Me, my husband, my sister, and her boyfriend were in our '68 Mustang, and we were so cool. We got some beer and had some weed, and we were just going to relax and enjoy the night. It was about 11 o'clock when we headed out. The place we were going to was a recreational area where people could camp, launch their boats, etc. To get into the place, though, you have to leave the main road, dirt and gravel, dip down toward the boat docks that made a loop onto the upper portion of the parking lot. Everything was going well. The moon lit things up enough that you could make out shapes around you. We had just parked the car and were talking. My husband lit up a joint and then passed it to me. We were in the front seats, my sister and her boyfriend in the back. Just as I was getting ready to take my hit, I saw something move out in front of the car, maybe 20 yards out. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer. I was turning to pass the joint back and saw it moving to the right of the car. My sister knew something was up right away. She was about to ask what was wrong when she saw this thing moving toward the back of the car. Note that I had barely taken a hit. My sister didn't smoke or drink, and no one else had time to do so. All of us were sober. We both said, "What is that?" The guys asked what, and we said something is out there. They just started to laugh, but then they saw it moving around the left of the car. At that point, I got the goosebumps all over my body, and I had a very bad feeling about the whole situation. This thing moved around to the front of the car again, but I noticed it was closer than before. At that point, I wanted to get out there, and fast. And of course, I was totally spooked, and the guys wanted to know what it was. This thing had circled the car once more, and when it got in front of it, again, my husband hit the headlights. Nothing. What the hell? It had been just right there a second before. When he hit the headlamp, it was on the right side of the car again, much closer than before. We just couldn't tell what it was. By this time, my sister, who was only 13, was freaking out, and so was I. We kept yelling for my husband to get us the fuck out of there. He must have been creeped out too, because he started the car, slammed it into reverse, and spun out there backwards, heading for the loop so we can get back to the main road. We skidded around the loop, dropped down toward the boat docks, and began the slight climb up to the main road. We thought we were in the clear, but just then the scariest thing I had ever experienced up until that time in my life happened. As we began to climb out of the edge of the headlights, but in plain view, a creature appeared. It stood upright like a person, but was extremely skinny and covered in long, kind of silvery brown hair. It turned when the headlight hit it, and we were so close we could see some pretty good detail. This thing looked directly into my eyes, and I swear it was giving me a good once-over, as if to memorize my face or something. Its eyes had dark pupils, and the look of them was like looking at a madman. Pure evil and insanity seemed to be the only thing in them. As soon as this happened, which couldn't have been more than just a few seconds, my husband hit the gas, as was aiming right for it. He said later he was trying to hit it. It then moved so fast it was almost a blur and was gone. Why it even got caught in the headlights, I don't know. All I know is that we beat feet out of there as fast as we could. It was freezing outside, and in the middle of nowhere. There was no homes, businesses, nothing. We couldn't figure out what we saw, but the only thing that came to mind was werewolf. Many creepy things happened in that area, and I refused to go there anymore. Story 9. Hi, my name is Kale, and this is a story of the first time that I saw a werewolf. It happened when I was a little boy, about 8 to 11 years old. I lived in Estonia, and I still do. Me with my stepfather, mother, older sister, and younger brother, and our dog had went in the summer to our summer home. It was a beautiful old house that my parents had bought. We bought new windows to it because they didn't have any. So one night, me with my sister wanted to sleep in a tent. So our stepfather set the tent up and we spent the night in there. I was a little nervous because I had heard that the forest near our house has bears. But my mother said that bears don't come close to humans. And well, she was right. What I saw wasn't a bear. At around midnight, when my sister was sleeping, I had to go to the bathroom. And so I got out and walked pretty far from the house to do my business. When I finished, I heard like a howl and screeching mixture. I looked around but didn't see anything. I thought it was in my head because I really like werewolves and wolves, but there were no wolves in our forest. Not that I would know, but I had asked my mother. I just felt like something or someone was staring at me, watching me. I started to walk back to the tent when I heard a scream that still haunts me. It was the scream of a deer, but it sounded like it was drowning. In a few minutes, I heard a rustle in the bushes. I looked toward the big bush near me, which was roughly 50 feet towards me, and saw an animal with red-yellow glowing eyes that were looking directly at me. I thought it was a neighbor's dog, but they lived a few miles away, and the dog isn't so big that it was. So I was startled because my second thought was a bear, and I didn't move because I knew when you meet a wild animal, you can't turn your back to it, so you had to walk away slowly backwards. But when I tried, I wounded my foot, and that thing growled at me so loudly. I couldn't walk away. I was afraid by knowing that it wasn't a bear. Bears don't growl like that. I stood there, this thing staring at me, and I started to smell a rotten stink mixture with blood. It growled again, with even more intensity. A few minutes had gone by, of which, of course, felt like hours. But then something happened, which I can only dream of. The thing stood on its back legs, and I saw what it looked like. Like I said, I was a big fan of werewolves, but I didn't think I would meet one. It was about 8 to 8.5 feet tall, with red, yellowish eyes, covered in fur. Upper body had longer fur than the lower part, and it looked like a man, but it was bigger, and had a tail, and had a wolf or German shepherd's head. That thing stared at me for more minutes and came closer. It had black claws and brown fur, and it sniffed me really close, like 5 feet away, and then stopped. It showed me its teeth by opening its mouth, and then I saw how its teeth were covered in blood. I think it saw how scared I was because I was crying. Then it turned around and walked toward the forest. But before it went in, it turned around and looked at me, like seeing if I was still watching. It howled and ran into the forest. When it was gone, I finally got my body to move and I walked to my tent. With my heart pounding in my chest, I finally got in and I could just feel the tears go down my face. I kept thinking about it and couldn't believe what I saw, so I tried to fall asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I wasn't sure if it was real or if I just had an intense dream. It felt so real, and at night there was a full moon. When I checked my phone, I saw a wound that I got last night, and I believed it was real. I haven't told anyone the story yet, because I don't like it when people say that I make stuff up, like with my other stories, but I saw it for real. I'm now older, and seeing the videos of true werewolf encounters, I believe I really did see a werewolf. I haven't seen any more of them, of course, but who knows? Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video, and the last video of the Western United States Dogman Encounters. Be on the lookout for the East Coast Dogman Encounter series coming soon. Also, have you gotten a cool What Lurks Beneath coffee mug yet? Well, you should. Visit our Teespring store in the description below to snag yourself one. Oh, and if you like my channel, be sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you. Tonight, we're going to continue our Dogman encounters of the Western United States. I know many of you are looking for it, and there's quite some eerie, hair-raising encounters. So get yourself ready. This is 10 Dogman encounters of the Western United States, Part 2. Story 1, Lynn County, Oregon. March 2017. It was 2:30 a.m. and another night of not being able to sleep due to back pain. I was lying on my side reading when my very close by neighbor's motion detector lights turned on. This happened from time to time, and when it turns on, it lights up the entire side of my house. We have lived here for 9 years, and I have never once seen anything walk past my bedroom window at night. Since I was facing my large bedroom window, the very bright motion detector light going off caught my attention. I looked up and saw the side of a silhouette of a dogman. I said, "Holy crap!" It was walking past my bedroom window. I saw it from mid-shoulder up. The shoulders were huge, and its head was humongous. It had pointed ears, just like a German shepherd dog, and a very long snout. Its mouth was slightly open, as I saw a large tongue that seemed to be lolling to the side of its mouth. When I saw this creature and spoke those words, I swear that thing slowed down, smirked, and then kept going. That's all I saw that night. Last week, though, while in my bedroom again, I heard something huge land on the ground behind my bedroom wall. That wall has no windows. I heard a really, really deep kind of raspy breathing. I just started praying, pleading the blood of Jesus over my house, grounds around it and all. I do this most nights, but sometimes I forget. I'm awake most nights until 3 a.m. or later, due to having severe spinal issues, as well as fibromyalgia. We live in a lovely manufactured home community. There are lots of trees around here, and it's very close to canals, large open fields, and a lot of woods. I know this is what I saw, but the fact that I saw it has left me amazed. Why is it that, when so many are also seeing them? I guess I just thought since I am in the house most of the time, due to my health, I would never see them. The space between my neighbor's house and ours is about 10 feet. My husband went outside weeks later, once I got the courage to tell him this had happened, and measured the area by the window. That Dogman had to be at least 8 feet tall. What concerns me greatly is that no one in the police department or government will alert people to their existence. People are walking around feeling a false sense of security. I know I did. I won't even try to walk outside anymore, and yes, I have cautioned my neighbors, the ones with the security light. I can't think of any other details right now, but it's important for you to know that several years ago, a homeless woman was camping out down by the river here in Albany. She was found dead, and her tent was really torn up. I believe the police report in the newspaper said she was torn up as well, but I honestly can't remember any of the details to be specific. To the best of my knowledge, no one was ever caught for that crime. This is a sleepy town, just well over 50,000 people. We no longer get the newspaper, so I have no idea if this happened again. I do know that a couple was down by that same area and saw a Dogman. It really frightened them badly. I heard about that on another YouTube channel. I just want people to be aware so they don't go out at night anymore, especially near the river. But then, we're not near a river, and I saw one in the middle of the night. Thank you for reading this report and doing all that you do. Story 2. I saw it in Oklahoma. Back in the early 90s, when I was 19 or so, I worked nights unloading trucks at a chain retail department store, back before they turned all into superstores. Anyway, several people started to notice that a coworker looked like she wasn't getting any sleep. One night, she told us a few on our break that she was having to leave early and take the long way to work and back home because of something she had seen. She previously always took a road called Moccasin Trail, but one night, the week before, while turning onto that road on her way to work, she said she saw a huge werewolf sitting in the grass, just watching cars go by. She said she had seen it on 4 or 5 occasions and just couldn't take it anymore. She said she was scared this thing was going to follow her, so she just completely avoided that road altogether. The way she described the sighting was when she would turn onto this road. Her headlights would light up the embankment across the road just enough so that she could see this big werewolf sitting about 30 feet up on the embankment. She said it would sit in the grass with its legs stretched out in front of itself. She said it would most often be leaning back, supporting itself on one or both of its elbows, in a kind of leisurely pose, just watching the cars pass by. She really seemed to be sincerely disturbed by her encounter. Over the years, I have heard several stories about strange happenings in that area. The Native Americans talked about other shapeshifters in that area. I don't know if that has anything to do with that girl sighting or not. I just thought it was worth mentioning. Story 3. Predator in Oklahoma. February 2016. I heard my dog barking and growling at around 3 a.m. one night. I got up and went to the back door to see what she was barking at. When I did, I saw her running up and down the backyard fence line, barking, growling, and urinating all over the fence, with her tail tucked in. My first thought was, there was a predator nearby. I knew something was wrong. I focused my eyes to see if I could see what she was barking at and whispered, "Holy shit." I saw something bent over, in a circle that was black and looked like it had a mane, like a lion. I looked at it for about 15 seconds and decided to run to the bedroom and get my head wrapped light. I put it on my head and ran to the back den and saw that it was still there. I carefully turned on the light and shined it right on it. When I did that, it turned around and looked right in my direction. Then it ran down the fence line with a smaller one in front of it. The best way I can describe it would be to say that it was the size of a lion. It had yellow eyes, pointed ears, huge shoulders, and a humongous chest. It ran on all fours. Also, this thing was so fast that it only took about 2 seconds to run down the entirety of the fence line. This wolf was way faster than my dog. I woke up my wife and told her what had just happened. I then went to the computer and Googled huge wolves in America. Under images, I found a cartoon of a drawing someone had did, and its head and mane looked just like what I saw. It was called a Dogman. Story 4. It happened in Cleveland. June 2000. I had been up all night at a friend's house in the town of Tribby playing video games. I didn't want to sleep there, so I said goodbye and headed home. I knew my car was making a funny noise, but I thought surely I could get home. Well, I was driving down a long, dark stretch of highway with nothing but forest and a few sparse country houses. I was coming up to the top of a long hill when suddenly my car stops pulling forward. The engine revved, but no gears would engage. My CV joint just went out. I was hoping that wouldn't happen. Well, I had no way of getting it home, so I backed up down the road in neutral and off onto a side road. I thought about staying and sleeping in the car, but something told me not to do that. I had an eerie feeling of being watched, so I grabbed my video game case and my machete that I had made from a lawnmower blade and started walking. I kept noticing the feeling of being watched, and it felt like I was being followed. I kept looking behind me and saw nothing, but when a car passed by, heading in the direction behind me, it illuminated the area with its headlights, and I saw something behind me, in the ditch, hunched down low. It was huge, and I could tell it looked animal, but had definite humanoid features. It seemed to have arms, but its head was mostly canine. Its head was very large, and its eyes glowed red when the lights hit them. Well, I've seen enough werewolf movies to know that this wasn't a good situation, so I started running. That probably wasn't the best choice, because I know that predators like to chase things that run from them. When the car had passed, the creature had darted into the trees. I thought that was the best time to run, so I did. I ran for about a quarter mile, and looked back but didn't see a thing, so I kept walking. Well, I kept checking behind me and off to the side, where the tree line was. I knew it was still out there, and probably following me, and yeah, I was afraid, but I was also prepared to defend myself, with my machete if need be. I came up onto another hill and saw a farmhouse off in the distance to my left, down a long dirt driveway. The moon was almost full, and the area around the house was clear, so I could see a guy out there messing with his trucks as I walked by. Then, he turned on a spotlight on his truck and spotted me with it. I kept walking because his property said no trespassing, and many out there wouldn't hesitate to unload on a strange trespasser. I knew it was close again. Probably closer now, and I was about to turn around and face it when another car came over the top of the hill and passed me, going behind me again. I followed with my eyes and noticed this time it was a cop. So thinking quickly, I dropped my machete on the edge of the grass and waved. As he passed, his lights hit the ditch as well, and I saw the Dogman was very close, but it darted into the trees yet again. Thankfully, a moment later the cop stopped and turned around. He came back and asked me what I was doing out there, so I told him what happened with my car. I didn't mention the Dogman though. He may have thought I was crazy, but I asked him for a ride home. He agreed after wanting to go check and make sure my car wasn't blocking the road. After we checked it, he agreed to take me home. I don't know what might have happened that night if he hadn't shown up, and it was the only time I was genuinely happy to see a police officer. Story 5. Dogman in Kansas. Early 2000s. If you know anything about Kansas, you'll know it's dry, flat, and void of much forestry. As a kid, I lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere. I remember that we had our own play set outside, complete with swings and monkey bars. Nearby was a large patch of overgrown weeds, almost as tall as 6 feet in some places. I hated playing at the play set, because sometimes, around sunset, I'd see red eyes from within the weed patch. I told my grandparents, but they dismissed it as coyotes. However, one day, I wanted answers and I approached the weeds. Upon closer inspection, I saw a creature that looked similar to a dog with shaggy white fur. I remembered that I thought its front paws looked like that of a gorilla's. The creature moved away from me and I never saw it in that weed patch again. A year later, I saw the same figure lurking in the dark outside of the house. I was so paranoid my mother could not get me to leave the house for a long time, except for only going to school. I haven't seen this humanoid since, nor am I completely sure if it's the fabled Dogman. Story 6. it appeared in the night. Summer of 2016. I was driving home doing some shopping in a nearby town and was all alone just driving and listening to the radio. It was just before sunset on a beautiful summer day. I was admiring the sky because it was such a bright orange. While driving through some S-curves in the road, I made the first turn and saw some deer dart across the road. Immediately, I hit the brakes to slow down, not knowing if there were more to come out of the woods. On the opposite side of the road, it drops down a steep embankment to a farm field. I had slowed the car down and scanned the tree line for more deer, and that's when this thing jumped out of the woods running after the deer. He landed in the middle of the road and cleared the rest of the road in his next stride alone. It's so hard to comprehend what I saw, but it sounds like the descriptions that people have claimed. It was a gray figure with a short, sleek coat. I did not see a tail on this creature. It was on all fours and was the same height as a deer. His head, though, was very odd. It looked like a dog head with cropped, pointed ears, but had a very short muzzle. He briefly turned his head towards me when he crossed, and his eyes, I wouldn't say they glowed, but they weren't normal animal eyes. They were like a dull yellow, and they definitely stood out. His body was what really confused me, because the way it moved was like a human would when trying to run on all fours. Its gait looked lazy, like he was just kind of loping across the road. It was very muscular on the front end, but had a very thin, almost sickly-looking abdominal area and hind legs. Once he was across the road, I lost sight of him over the embankment. I was so confused as to what I saw that I didn't tell anyone right away, for fear that they would think I was crazy. I had been searching for answers since then, but came up with nothing. I eventually told my husband and one close friend, but neither of them had heard anything that matched my description. I'm still not 100% sure that I saw a Dogman, but it's the only thing I have come across that sounds reasonably close to what I had seen. Story 7. The Beast of Jackson County. September 13th, 2013. Before I say anything about my encounter, I'd been studying wolves and their behavior for about 3 years before I had this encounter, and I know that considering Jackson County has about 656 square miles with a population of roughly 675,000, and it being practically infested with wildlife such as deer, livestock, and predators such as coyotes and foxes, it wouldn't be likely for a large predator such as a wolf to be lurking in the sparse woodlands. The average wolf territory is 13 to 2,400 square miles, and it'd be easy for such a huge creature to just live in the Jackson County alone. This may even be the very same dog-wolf-man thing that other people had seen. Anyway, on to the encounter. I was just chilling on the laptop in the living room, watching people blow stuff up, when I felt like I had to go to the bathroom. I set the laptop down and put my headphones on the keyboard and got out of the chair. Let me clarify, I'm not a bloody psychic or a medium or anything, but I have a sort of sixth sense where I can tell if something is watching me, and I knew something was. We have a huge window on the wall just above the couch, and it was a particularly cold night, so the windows caught things like breath fairly well. I turned to the window, thinking that whatever it was watching me from there, and I knew I'd see it if it was, and it'd have to be either standing on something or tall as the devil himself in order to see into the window of our trailer, since it was around 8 feet off the ground, with the top of it being about 11 feet. I looked over to see the window, and the only thing I could see was the floodlights were on, and something seemed to duck under the window, like a kid playing hide and seek. I didn't think anything of it, considering our neighbors were sort of druggies and alcoholics and often came to look in our windows, and every opening to the house was also locked, so I had nothing to worry about. I went to the bathroom, and when I finished I washed my hands and went back to the laptop. I noticed that the floodlights went out, so whatever it was gone. Not thinking anything else of it, I went back to watching people blow stuff up on YouTube. I should mention also that my eyes are sharp sharp enough to spot a bird at about 50 feet away in a tree. So it's no surprise that when the floodlights came back on, I noticed immediately. I glanced up from the screen, expecting a drunken or high idiot to be looking in with a stupid expression on his face, but I was frozen by what I saw. It was a huge, huge wolf that was looking at me with dirty, ambery yellow eyes. Its ears looked like they were torn or cropped or something, and the face looked sort of human-like. Not really a full human face, but more like the jawline looked very masculine and human compared to the rest of its face. Its lips were curled back, and it seemed as if it were snarling, though I couldn't hear the words, and its breath caught on the cold glass. It was so tall that the top of its head was halfway up the window, and if I had to guess how wide it was, I'd probably say maybe the width of my shoulders. I knew that whatever it was most likely had to have wolfish instincts, so I did the only thing I knew to do, which was avoid eye contact and make yourself look as small as you could whilst having your throat and underside showing. This is a very common submissive position, and although I was scared out of my mind, I knew that holding eye contact would make me seem like a challenger, and running would make me seem like prey. When I did the submissive position, it must have worked for it to leave me alone because it just hit the window, which made the entire trailer shake, and it went away. I hadn't heard or seen anything else since, though I do hear the odd howl coming from the back roads. God help the poor idiot that decides to try and hunt this thing down. I can tell you now that whatever it was not friendly, because if it were, it wouldn't have slammed my window as hard as it had, and it would not have been growling like I'd taken its food. Although it practically did assault my window, I could understand why it was upset. I was on its territory, after all, an intruder and possibly a threat to its existence and its prey. It's really just best to stay out of its way and respect it. After all, it is one of God's many strange creatures in this world. Story 8. Stay out of the woods. June 6th, 2015. Since it was summer break for my school, I was lazily lounging at home watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area I live in. My home is on the outskirts of the city I live in. I had about 5 or 7 chickens at the time, and we hadn't expanded the coop, so it was a small pen connecting to 2 sides of the chicken coop, which is wooden and sturdy. The only ways to get into the coop is either through the trap door attached to the big door and the 3 windows. One window is on one side of the door, and the second window is on the other side. The third window is a large window. Keep in mind that they all have traps connected to them so they can be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland that we call the back pasture, and if you've ever been back there, you could see that it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around at the time, and I don't know how it got there. We had been having trouble with poachers for quite a while, considering the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam, one that was motion activated. There was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree a long time ago, and the tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there's a large cornfield owned by our neighbors, and beyond that is a forest. I don't know what the forest is like beyond the field since we've never been there. I went outside to do something with my chickens, and I had brought along a bucket of corn for feeding the deer after. When I walked out of my home, I saw a doe was sitting in the tall grass. I thought it was sleeping since its head had been down and wasn't moving. I, being the curious little nut I was, decided that I would sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it to show my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could across the yard that separated me from the deer. I should also mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit in it that was filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer, and when I had cleared the burn pit and was about 10 yards from it, I realized that the deer wasn't asleep, but it was dead. It was the most disgusting sight I'd ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone, the flesh on the body of the doe shredded to pieces, and blood absolutely everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while, and it smelt like it too. Most of the blood was dried, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed to be like a hint of wet dog. Something that creeped me out about the scene was, although it was a rotting carcass, there were no insects at all around it. It was as if the usual lively forest was deader than the deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle made a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking that I would come out later with my mother and grain the deer when she got home. Then I started to walk back to the house. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard a low, snarling growl that sounded like a wolf, although it seemed distorted, as if it were being played on an old radio. Against my better judgment, I turned my head around and I saw what looked like the biggest freaking werewolf you'd ever seen. It was on all fours. Its fur was black and matted in places. Its face was what you'd expect a wolf to look like, although it was broad and the muzzle seemed a little short. Although the way it was curling its lips made it look as if its snout was plenty long, and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow, like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim, amber, dark red yellow, if that makes sense. Its ears looked like that of a Doberman pincer, with a cropped effect. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its paws, if you can even call them paws, looked like huge hands with long claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could ever imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it seemed amplified as if it were being played through a microphone, and the sound was coming out of a loudspeaker. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids. It was so big. It had no tail that I could tell, and it seemed to tower over me. Although I was a good 10 meters from it, I was about 5 foot 4 inches at the time, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a loud howl, which sounded more like a roar, and it charged me. Doing the only thing I knew to do while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I began to run away from it. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but was most likely only a few seconds, and running inside, slamming and locking all the doors and windows. As I calmed down a small bit, I had realized that if it had really wanted to kill me, that it would have. That what I had experienced was not an attack charge, but a bluff. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened almost 2 years ago, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening, I have been weary around the woods, only going in them in broad daylight, only when I absolutely had to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I cannot say that I am one of those people that have stopped experiencing things after the encounter, although I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June. Nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago, when I was staying up at night playing on the laptop. I had started to hear things moving around on the porch, and turned on the light to see the shape of something huge disappearing behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter, when I was helping my mother clear brush from the hunting clearing. I was going to get the mower and was walking the trail to do so when I heard bipedal footsteps following me off to my side. They stopped whenever I stopped, and I eventually ran out of the woods, and I haven't been back since. I asked my late grandmother about the creature I had seen in the woods, and she informed me that there was something called the wolf-head man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their teepees. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house had actually been built on a tribal burial ground, and I have since been wondering that if that had anything to do with it. I hadn't heard about the wolf-head man before she had told me about it. When I saw that there were several eyewitness reports that were proved to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had an attempt to tell people previous to this submission, but everyone either said I was stupid, crazy, or just plain lying. One thing's for certain, I am not stupid, I am not crazy, and I am most definitely not a liar. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a Dogman. Story 9. Dogman, not Bigfoot. 2013. I wasn't there, but my son-in-law, and their friends saw a Dogman. My son called me all freaked out that they had seen a Bigfoot because he knows I believe in Bigfoots. Now, my son always made fun of me for believing in Bigfoots. He asked me, "Dad, can Bigfoots run on all fours?" I said, "Yes, why do you ask?" And he said, "Dad, we just saw one out spotlighting rabbits." I asked him to describe what it looked like, and he said they were hunting rabbits with a spotlight, and he saw something hunched over. He said he then yelled to the others and let them know that he had seen something, and then started to shine his light on it. At first, he thought it was a large bird because it was down like it was eating something. Then it stood up on its hind legs and spread its arms out wide, and then when the other two came to look at it, it dropped down and took off faster than anything they had ever seen before. He said it had a dog's snout and was covered in fur, but you could see it was very muscular. Now, my son is 6'2", and he felt it stood as tall or taller than him. When it took off, they ran after it and watched it jump and clear a huge rock pile in one leap, like nothing. That scared them, and they all ran back to their car to get out of there. I spoke to all three, and they had the same story and described it the same way. I told my son that that's not a Bigfoot, because Bigfoots don't have dog snouts. I told him, "You saw a Dogman." It's funny that this happened around a lot of cornfields. The area also had caves and was covered in sagebrush. When I was just a boy, my father was the night watchman at a manufacturing plant located in a rural area between Big Rapids and Chippewa Lake, Michigan. Our house, which, if I remember right, was a perk of the night watchman job. It was across the street from the factory. The plant building was right next to a large wilderness area of state land. At the time, it was simply known as the Hay Marsh, but now it is officially called the Hay Marsh State Game Area. We didn't understand it at the time, but Dad was always very skittish about letting us play outside after dark. He would sometimes talk about hearing coyotes or bears roaming around in the hay marsh when he was walking the perimeter of the building at night. One night, in the summer of 1961, Dad walked back to the house to sit on the porch and have a cup of coffee and a sweet roll. He had a good view of the entire plant property. He saw some movement near a chain-link fence behind the building. This was approximately 3 a.m., so he felt quite sure this person wasn't there by accident. He drew his gun and watched for a few minutes. That's when he noticed this was not a person at all, but something much taller. He said it appeared to be covered in brown/gray hair. It had very broad shoulders and a powerful chest. It alternated between walking on 4 legs, then standing up on 2. He said it seemed to be looking for something along the driveway. He later said he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He quietly moved into the house and grabbed his Kodak Signet 35mm camera, which was his pride and joy. At this point, I should mention that Dad was quite a photography buff. His father had owned one of the first camera stores in all of Ohio, and Dad got the shutter bug from Grandpa. As he stepped back onto the front porch, the creature moved slowly along the driveway, directly underneath the lights. He adjusted the camera shutter for a long exposure, held it as still as he could. He said he was shaking pretty bad by then, and snapped a picture. I've enclosed a print of it in this letter. Dad said a few seconds later, the thing dropped back down to all 4s and slowly moved off into the woods. He sent a print to the local newspaper and sent copies to several magazines. One that I think was called Mysterion published the photo in their spring issue of '62. Dad had a copy of the magazine for years, but it was misplaced after he passed away. I still have the negative strip that contains this image, if you would like to have someone examine it. I also still have my dad's Kodak Signet. I haven't shot any pictures with it for several years, but I'm pretty sure it still works. Sparta, 1987. One weekend, back around fall in 1987, my two best friends and I were staying at my family's cabin, which is not too far from the small town of Sparta, about 20 minutes north of Grand Rapids. My two friends later left to have dinner while I stayed behind in the cabin. Following the dinner, the men headed back towards Sparta and the cabin. What happened next would shock and disturb them for years. It was dark, and they were on a rural road. Suddenly, both of them saw something standing by the side of the road. In the headlights of the car, it appeared to be a human-like figure, covered in gray fur. As they got closer and past the figure, both of them got a very good look at it. It was the size of a man, standing on two legs. It was covered head to toe in gray fur, and had a wolf-like face. It even raised its hands and seemed to snarl at them as they drove by. They said it looked like a werewolf, right out of a Hollywood movie. My two friends didn't dare stop by. They continued driving. And of course, they were peppering each other up with questions. As they are having this animated conversation, they passed by the sign that says, "Welcome to Sparta," and drove through the small main street and continued out on the town in the direction of my cabin. Their conversation about what had just happened continued when both of them looked up to see the same "Welcome to Sparta" sign again, followed by the same main street that they had just driven through only moments ago. They hadn't stopped or turned around. They had been traveling in the same direction, on the same road, but somehow, without any noticeable interruption in their journey, they had somehow been sent backwards several miles. Until this point, it would be easy to dismiss this event as someone merely playing a joke. However, the time displacement characteristic is what sets this encounter apart. While such things are well documented in UFO and alien abduction stories, it's something we've not seen before in Dogman's sighting reports. Andy continues, "I remember when they finally showed up in my cabin. They arrived no later than what I expected them to, around 9 p.m. or so, and I remember how animated they were about their strange encounter, but I just assumed that they had seen a large dog and were telling me an embellished story in order to get a laugh. But 20 years later, both of them still insist that this was no joke. I have no idea what to make of this story. Maybe it was just some teenagers in a werewolf costume, playing pranks. And did my friends really experience lost time afterwards? Or did they just make some wrong turns on their drive and didn't notice because they were talking and distracted? I have no idea, but I would love to know if anyone else has seen similar things in the Sparta area. Reed City, 1993. The area around Reed City, Michigan has been a hotbed of Dogman activity. This report details an event that occurred nearly 20 years ago, but the witness remembers it like it was yesterday and is unshakable in her story. Her name is Courtney, and her encounter took place during the winter of 93 into 94. Courtney was a teenager at the time and was sneaking cigarettes behind her parents' home near Todd Lake northeast of Reed City. The sun was setting on a clear, cold winter day. Courtney was facing a large abandoned barn on the property next door. The barn had always kind of spooked me. It was filled with old, rusty equipment. The outer planks were all rotten, and it sagged and leaned in every direction. My dad said to stay away, as the whole thing was weak and could collapse. On that evening, I was standing about 50 feet from the barn and saw sunlight coming through the gaps in the sliding. Courtney took her eyes off the barn for a few minutes. Then, something caught her attention again. There was movement. The light flickered, but I couldn't really tell what it was. Then it turned its head back and looked straight at me. It was at least 6 feet tall, if not more. It was dark-colored. It had a dog-like appearance, pointy nose and really big, pointy ears. Courtney dashed into her house to grab a flashlight. When she returned outside, she shined it toward the barn door, but the animal was no longer there. She walked closer to the barn to look for tracks in the heavy snow. When she didn't see any, she realized the creature might still be inside and ran back to the safety of the house. She never saw the creature again. She later talked to a neighbor who had seen something the size of a buffalo but the shape of a dog in the same barn just a few months before Courtney's encounter. The neighbor said she had been so frightened she was near hysterics for days. Her father had taken his gun and searched the barn, but found nothing. At the time of these events, neither of the girls had heard of the legend song and did not know about the Michigan Dogman until years later. Watersmeet, 1994. This report comes to us from an anonymous contributor who grew up in a nearby county, but spent many years of summer camping on family property in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. This encounter took place in the area of Watersmeet, home of the famous Paulding Lights phenomenon. Oddly enough, the Paulding Lights are also known as the Dog Meadow Lights. I was 13, had just gotten new rollerblades for Christmas, and since the main road where our property sits is paved, I couldn't wait to ride around. I went blading by myself and stopped to rest for a second. On this road, the woods are so thick, there's not much space between the road and the woods in most parts. And I remember seeing trees pushed down on the road that my dad said was done by bears, since my dad was an avid bear hunter. I remember not hearing any of your normal sounds of nature, not even birds. The air was still, and the sky would be pure dark in not too long. I was deciding to turn back when I heard a rustling behind me, and something emerged from the left side of the road. I assumed it was a deer, and paused and made myself as quiet as I could so I could watch, and slumped down on my stomach in the middle of the road. It was about 600 feet ahead of me. When I got myself settled in the road to watch it and look up, I realized what I was looking at wasn't a deer. It was on all fours, with brown, grayish fur. At first, I feared the worst, thinking a bear had caught my scent, until I saw its outline and color. I thought I was looking at a dog until I realized the face was too primitive looking, like a fox or a coyote. At this point in my life, I had never seen a wolf in real life, and it was far too far for me to make it out of the face exactly. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources has always recognized that wild wolves still roamed in Upper Peninsula, although they were thought to be in very limited numbers, and only in extremely remote areas. It is conceivable this witness was seeing one of those wolves, but then something strange happened. It extended its front legs and in the slowest, longest seconds of my life, stood up on its hind legs, sniffed the air, walked for about 5 steps, then got back down on all fours and walked to the other side of the woods, then disappeared. I don't remember how long I laid in the middle of the road, staring in the empty space. I saw this thing stand, like a human. I remember my jaw hanging down as low as it could, and a pool of drool on the cement underneath it. It finally clicked in my mind that perhaps I should rollerblade my butt back to camp as quick as I could. The witness reports that while the creature never stalked or pursued her, she slept very little during the rest of the family camping trip. She never told anyone about what she had seen, fearing she would be ridiculed. At the time of her sighting, she had never heard of the legend song, and would not until 2004. She moved to Southern California in 2008, and has no interest in camping ever again. Pina, 2001. My dad and I have a story to tell about our encounters with the Dogman. My dad's story took place in the mid-70s. There is a cemetery behind the Alpena High School and a wooded area beyond that. There are many trails that run through here. And this area is a place called the Sandies, where all the young kids would go and party. My dad and 2 of his buddies were in a canoe in broad daylight, paddling from the Sandies around the back of the cemetery. The banks of the river are 10 to 12 feet high in places, and some trails run right to the edge. The 3 of them saw what looked to be a big dog running behind them on the trail. They didn't pay much attention to it until they heard a splash. When they looked, it was swimming after them. Then it went from a dog paddle to the chest, and front legs coming out of the water and wading after them. They decided right then not to wait around to see what it was. Honestly, I thought it was BS at the time, and I'm not sure even to this day if it was something they had been smoking or drinking. Then around 2001 to 2002, I was leading some friends through the Sandy's trails. I used to like taking people out, even without a flashlight, tell them my dad's story, just to freak them out. The girls were freaked out before we even got into the woods, so I decided not to scare them that night. In the river are small several islands connected by a small sliver of land. At that time, there were 3 such islands chained together, and I took them through to the last one, which was planted with pines and nice even rows. I was the first one back there, about 30 seconds ahead, when one of the girls got her foot hung up on something. As I was going back to help her, there was a spot where the trees make a sort of roof effect, which is really cool looking at night with the moon shining through. At that point, I saw something. I'm not sure what it was, but it sent me running out double time. When my buddy saw my face, he didn't say a word. He just followed, both of us dragging the girls behind. When he asked me later why I came out in such a hurry, I told him it was because I thought I had seen something at the other end of the island walking through the trees that was very tall and not likely human. He may not have believed me, but he never questioned it either. I'm still not sure what I saw. It could have easily been that I scared myself with my dad's story and was seeing things, but I know this. I still don't like the dark, and even though I love hunting, I hate going out before the sun comes up during deer season. Bendon, 2007. This sighting report is told secondhand by the brother-in-law of the witness. The witness is a prominent person in local government and wishes to remain anonymous. The situation started last Saturday night, around midnight, when he was coming home from a friend's house in Benzonia and taking the back way home to Traverse City. He stated that while down Cinder Road, several miles outside of the town of Bendon, he observed a pair of eyes reflecting off his headlights directly ahead of him. Thinking that it was probably a deer alongside of the road, he began to slow down. As he got closer, however, he stated that the object was much larger and much darker than a deer. He said that by this time, he had slowed to around 30 miles per hour and was at that point several hundred feet from the creature, which still had not moved. As he approached further, he stated that the only way he could describe the creature was being similar to a very large, dark wolf. However, he observed that this thing wasn't on 4 legs, but was upright, back 2 legs standing near a road-killed deer. He estimated that the creature stood a little over 6 feet tall and had very dark fur. He stated that, by now, he was going slow enough to bring his truck to a stop in the road and observe the creature, which had not yet moved and was still staring at him. He told me that for a brief second, he believed that the object was a giant stuffed animal, put there as some kind of a joke, due to the fact that he had never seen anything like this in his life, and that he was able to drive up on it as close as he was, without it having moved an inch. He told me, however, that before he could finish that thought, the creature dropped to all 4 legs and sprinted across the road and disappeared into the woods on the other side of the roadway. He told me that he stayed frozen in his seat for a minute, wondering in the middle of the road at what the heck had just happened. I jokingly asked him if he had been drinking that night, and with a deadly serious face, he sternly stated, "No. Whatever that was, it was real." As perplexed as he was that night over what he had seen, he was deathly afraid to go wandering into the woods to investigate further. He said that in using a flashlight, he observed an animal's tracks leading into the woods on the opposite side of the road, and was fortunate enough that night to have his digital camera with him. He showed me a photograph of the paw print, which he said appeared to be about 7 or 8 inches long. He had another picture of the same paw print, where he had placed a shotgun shell in the middle of it for scale. He told me that he was lucky that the side of the road was so soft, because he wasn't willing to go any farther than 2 or 3 steps away from the door to his truck, just to get a picture. I inquired if the animal had made any sounds before it disappeared, and he said that he did not hear it make any noise, and were it not for the picture, I inquired if the animal had made any sounds before it disappeared, and he said that he did not hear it make any noise, and were it not for the picture, he would have thought that he had imagined the whole thing. I asked him if it could have been a bear, and he stated, "Absolutely not. He bear hunts every year in the Upper Peninsula, so he obviously knows what bears look like up close." That's his story. Believe it if you'd like. If I didn't know him as well as I do, and hadn't seen pictures, I would have said that he was out of his mind. I've heard the song and know some of the stories, but always believed it was just for entertainment value. After this happened, though, I am looking at all of this under a whole new light. I am an avid hunter. My name is Bo, and I have hunted and fished all my life. I joined the Army straight out of high school, and now I work 6 days a week. But enough about me. Y'all want to know what true nightmares are made out of. I have found out last October, hunting in New River. I had gotten up early that morning and cooked breakfast for my fiancée. My fiance loves fried eggs in the morning, and I do them exactly like she likes. So we eat, and I get my camo out of the bag, as well as my rifle out of the cabinet. We headed out that morning, and I took my fiance to work. Her work was on the way to New River. When we pull in, I give her a kiss, and she tells me to bring her home something good. I told her I would, and I got back in my jacked-up Chevy 2500. The trip to the mountain was as gorgeous as always, and the Tennessee back roads are amazing and beautiful. So I got to my stand, but it was so eerily quiet that morning. Around noon, I decided to go to the truck and grab a sandwich and another bottle of water. So I eat a peanut butter and syrup sandwich my fiance made me while I was getting ready. She even had time to write me a note and basically said she loved me and was happy that we were together, since it was only 1 month out from having our little girl, and she was just an amazing old lady. After I got done, I decided to walk to the tree stand again. On my walk back, in the woods, I start to have this feeling of dread, that something is wrong, that something just isn't right. But I brush it off, thinking maybe it's just nerves, since this is hog country after all, and I've been chased on the road before that I'm walking on. But this just kept getting worse and worse. I started getting deeper down the ridge, closer to my stand, and I hear a twig break, and I stop. Now, me being an experienced hunter, I notice movement in this thicket just about 50 or so yards away. I notice this brown shape moving out towards me, so I crouch down, ready my rifle, and I train my rifle on the color. When I get to noticing that this thing is grunting, yes, a big buck. God, was I wrong. The thing slowly walked out closer and closer, and I realized that, wow, this creature's so massive, it's way bigger than a deer on all fours. So I'm thinking, okay, an elk is walking out. Cool. But I noticed its head and the shape is all wrong. It slowly starts walking out. All of a sudden, it stops and stands up. I mean, on 2 legs, it's easily 8 feet tall, but because I'm 6'6", the thicket is just above my head, and this thing's almost a foot to 2 feet above it. It starts sniffing the air, and its head steps right to my direction. I freeze up at that moment, feeling like I'm concreted to the ground. The wolf thing that I was looking at was beginning to let out this real, deep, almost demonic-like growl. It starts snarling, showing its teeth towards me. I, being army trained, realized if it charges, I'm only getting 1 shot at this thing, so I'd have to make it count. All of a sudden, it begins to tear through the bushes on all 4s again. I realize the movie Van Halen's Werewolf is charging at me at full speed. I realized I'm in big trouble, and I hear this branch break behind me. I look over my shoulder and see that there is a second, larger wolf behind me on 2 legs. It is easily 9 feet tall, built like a bodybuilder with jet black fur. It drops to all 4 and starts running full speed towards me. But this one was a lot closer. I spin around and see that this thing is too fast for me to unsafely shoot at with my rifle. I jump out of the way of this monstrous beast charging me. I end up hitting the hard rocks and slid into the red clay mud, just to realize it already crossed the roadbed I'd been walking on, and the 2 wolves are set on a collision course. When the bigger black wolf hits the lighter brown wolf, he tackles the brown wolf to the ground. As they are rolling down the hill and clawing and biting and slamming each other into the hard ground, the smaller brown wolf kicks and paws from the bottom when its back claws rip the big black wolf's stomach wide open and throws him off onto the ground. The brown wolf then turns to me. It snarls and starts charging again at full speed. I am awestruck by the power of the wolf and the sheer size of it as it's on its way towards me. But the big black wolf slams the brown one from behind, running its arm through the brown one's side, picking it up and clamps its massive jaws on its shoulder as it throws the brown one down away from me. It lands and rolls about 10 yards and jumps up running away, back through the brush. I let out the breath I didn't even realize I was holding in at that moment. I look at the now bloody and beaten, ripped open black wolf, which is standing with blood dripping off its back claws and glistening white teeth, dripping with the blood of the brown wolf. And for some reason, it registers to me that I have to show that I am no threat to the king of the mountain. I lower the rifle down away from me, and as I do this thing smirks at me, lets out an ear-shattering roar that turns into a howl. As it looks into my soul, I see the eyes of a beast, and I can understand that it was there to show it was the alpha, and as long as I showed him respect, he will not be a threat. It turned to drop on all fours and ran away after the other. I instantly take off running. Luckily for me and the army, it allowed for me to stay in great shape. I take off up the ridge and make it to the truck. As soon as I get to the door, I realize there's blood all over the side of my truck. I hesitate to look, but I had to know. I flip the rifle safety off, ready to blast anything that jump up from the bed of the truck. I realize there is a big, dead doe laying in the bed of my truck that has had its neck broken. I jump in, start the truck, spin it around, throwing gravel and 2 tails. I'm tearing ass out of the woods, and I fly all the way down the mountain, through the back roads, and don't stop till I reach Denver. My fiance can tell I'm shaken up, so she ends up taking me home. I tell her everything, but we decide to tell everyone that I hit the doe with my truck, and I got spooked by it, because who would believe me, right? That is, till I got to hearing other people who have seen this massive animal as well. So I thought that this would be the best way for me to get the story off my chest and not get told I'm crazy or lying or making it up. I just wanted to warn every hunter and hiker around that we ain't the top of the food chain or the king of the mountain, because the king of the mountain is a truly massive beast who has no predators. Thanks again for helping me get this off my chest. Now, let me tell you about my second encounter. I have the Bigfoot encounter where me and my fiance had seen that same wolf man. We have been going hunting in New River again. We have seen a family of Bigfoot for 3 or 4 years now. They have never been aggressive or anything like that. They show respect and are generally curious creatures. There is 4 Bigfoot in the area. The big male is jet black and about 9 to 10 foot tall. He looks like a jacked hair man. The second largest is a female, about 8 foot tall, a light brown color with black stripes down her shoulders and back. The 2 smaller ones are between 6 and 8 foot tall, both lighter brown. There is 1 male and 1 female juvenile. The young male is a dark brown with a light brown patch on his chest. The young female is a light golden brown and absolutely gorgeous in color. We usually see them all together as a family unit, or the 2 males going out together. Looks as if hunting, possibly because they have both been on the deer trails, or the gravel and dirt roads to cross the area. They are all very curious. They have been known to walk up close, within 50 yards or so, whooping and chirping to me and my fiance. We have had a blast seeing them, and getting them used to us being in the area. We have built a cabin down in the holler of the ridge. This cabin in the woods is set next to a gorgeous place, set between creek branches, but in a way that we can get a vehicle to the door. We started first seeing the male, and I was nervous because it isn't too far where I'd seen the 2 dogmen fighting originally. Shortly after we got to seeing the full family, they'd check out the truck or look in the windows at night to see if we were cooking. There for a while, my fiancée was scared of them, and then she realized that they were just curious. It has been amazing to see the young ones playing around in the creek on hot summer days. The big male lying in the cool mud, with the big female laid up in the shade while the two youngsters playing, splashing and rolling in mud, and even throwing mud. Once, the young male ran up behind me while I was fixing a tree stand that was sitting in the bed of my Chevy 2500. He scared me with the loud steps, running up behind me. Then he let out a rather strange whoop, almost as if he said boo. As he said woo, I jumped around, startled, and the young one was standing there, laughing like a little fat feller who would be holding his stomach. Kinda like a backwoods Satan-style laugh. I laughed at him and said, "You little shit." The big male walked up and grunted towards him. He waved and ran away. My fiancée had stepped out on the porch when she had heard the sound and waited to see them some more, since it's been the second time that morning that they'd been around. She's seen me and the big male standing only 10 yards away from each other. He dwarfed me. I seen her face, and it showed she was nervous, if not scared. It was a bit shocking to see him so up close, to have been close enough to smell his musky aroma. Last weekend, I noticed he got a new open wound on his chest. It was 4 big claws down his burly, leathery chest. We left some fruit that was going bad out for him, so he could get to it a bit easier, so he'd heal up, because it showed me that he would protect the area. This weekend, we went up again, but didn't hear them or see them anywhere. I was honestly kind of worried that something happened to him, and that the family would be in trouble. So I kept looking for them that Friday night, not seeing them all night long. The next morning, my fiancée and I got up and had breakfast. We went hunting up the ridge just a ways and had a wonderful day together. We always have been side by side. Her love of hunting just made her so much more attractive to me. I honestly am the luckiest man in the world to have her as my partner. Saturday evening, we got back down to the camp, and we noticed something had been through the leaves all around the camp. It gave us a bit of hope that they're all okay. We had then gotten ready for supper, started cooking as the sun was setting. In New River, it gets pitch black dark in just a few moments. My fiancée had stepped out to the porch to go grab me a bottle of Jack out of the truck, and I heard the door open on the truck. I heard it slam as she came running through the door, and I dropped everything, and I hurried to make sure that she's okay. And she was standing there saying that she thought our big male neighbor was coming up the creek bed towards us. So we decided to turn the camp stove down so we could step outside to watch him approach. So as we are standing there, I light a cigarette and hand it to my fiancé. As I light my own, I realized he is walking kind of weird and not sounding good. His normal strong, crisp sounding grunts are sounding more deep and raspier. I take the bag of fruit out the back truck, and we walk down closer to the creek bed. We creep back up the creek bank towards camp. As we are, the critter is coming closer to me, not knowing I stepped into a hole where one of the young ones had grabbed a clump of mud and thrown it. I hit the ground hard as I was stepping backwards, and I stood back up, quickly trying not to spook the Bigfoot with my pain groan. My fiancée turned and helped me back to my feet, but as she turned her back from the animal, my heart sank as I seen the deep pitch black wolf man that had won the fight before with the brown wolf. He starts picking up pace towards us, and in that moment, I jumped to my feet. I told my fiancée to run, that I'd hold it off as long as I could. Its massive body jumps through the creek, still at an incredible speed, and so I put myself between the beast and I and my old lady, the love of my life. I couldn't let anything happen to her, so I am putting myself in front, charging him, yelling this primal roar I never knew I had from the deepest place of my soul. The wolfman breaking out of the water on a full sprint towards me, as I have gotten his attention now. I draw a Bowie knife out of this sheath my grandfather had left over from the Vietnam War. At this moment, knowing I'm going to die as he would destroy me, all of a sudden, there is a roar from the top of the hill. Standing proud, the young female was roaring and beating her chest as the wolf stops. So do I, to see the new creature trying to enter the fray. My fiancée stops on a dime, and she was staring at me with tears in her eyes as I realized that he has the hunting rifle from the bed of the truck. The wolf starts to snarl and growl. He realizes he's in trouble, and he bats me away, onto my back. My fiancé takes a shot and shoots him. The shot goes into the chest, but it barely grazes him, as my fiancé comes running up to me and having another gun with her, handing it to me. We realized that the young female and young male standing across the creek had started throwing rocks at the wolfman. I start backing up slowly towards my fiancé as the big male bursts from the thicket and clears the creek in one jump, and the massive male standing between us and the wolfman. He is roaring and beating his chest. The wolf then starts running again. The big male Bigfoot and the alpha wolfman hit into this devastating brawl. The wolf clawing and slashing the big male, proudly standing there. He grabbed the wolf by the throat and held him back as the two youngsters are pelting the wolfman with rocks. The male swinging its massive large arms down on the wolf and dropping it to its knees. But as that's going on, the wolf slashes the Bigfoot's legs, dropping him to his knees. The Bigfoot and wolfman both being dropped to their knees, and as the Bigfoot hits its knees, it lets out a pained bellow. The wolfman jumps on top of him. Then, one of the other Bigfoot swings a downed tree and smashes the wolfman right in the head. As it flips backwards, she swings, breaking the log across its stomach. He jumps and runs away, the female making a delicate chirping and clicking as she kneels down to the male. The young ones across the creek to reunite with the two larger family members. My fiancé is running to my side, wrapping me in a hug and holding me, saying thank God. The big male getting his bearings standing up from the ground and about 10 yards away from me. He looks at me and does this light chirping and clicking toward me, cocking his head like a dog would, seeing if I was okay. The whole family standing there in front of us, while me, my fiancé, and the entire family of Bigfoot all let out this huge ringing roar together. It was kind of like a victory roar. Then they slowly make their way back up the hill to the top of the ridge where I believe their cave is located. Me and my fiancé head back to the cabin and get back inside. She checks me out, wraps up my ribs as we load the truck in record time. We leave out of there in the jacked 2500 Chevy. Fiancé holding my hand, saying that she's so proud of me and is just thankful that I'm okay. And we got to tearing down the mountain every bump, reminding me of my bruised ribs. I thanked her for coming back for me, and we get to the main road. She leans over, gives me a kiss, and we get the hell out of Dodge. Hey guys, What Lurks Beneath here. I hope you enjoyed this really cool Dogman versus Bigfoot story. I know it might have been a little difficult to listen through just because of how the story was sent in kind of shambles, so I had to slightly reformat it. But hopefully it's written in a way you can generally get the message across. Again guys, if you like my content, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you all in the next video. I have been hesitant on posting any story, mainly due to the fact I don't want anyone ever thinking that I, or the person that the story is about, is crazy. Although saying this actually happened sounds very cliché, but I can assure you the following stories are true. Now, before I begin the first story, just a bit of background on me. I am an intern for a church that does work on Navajo reservation site, helping the community on people's homes. You know, like roofing repair, repainting, and interior fixing. 8 to 5, with good pay and nice people, so overall, I'm happy with this. And as a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not trying to offend any Navajo tradition in any way. This is just a first-hand story on what is currently happening on my trip. Over the past 2 months of my internship, I have begun to grow fairly close with some of the residents on the res. One lady in particular that I got to know pretty well was the superstitious type. Like I said, never be outside at night or other random seeming things to me. But the biggest taboo I knew to never mention, mainly because I was told by my superiors, said never be outside at night or other random things like that. But the biggest taboo I knew was to never mention, mainly because I was told by my superiors, was Navajo folklore like skinwalkers. However, one day it was very different in the sense that the question was just burning within me. I was on my lunch break after wrapping up painting parts of her house, and she sits next to me on her porch, and we talk for a while, but I finally feel comfortable enough to ask her about any folklore, about werewolves, or anything of that sort. I didn't really expect a response. I thought maybe she'd quickly say no, and then change the topic. But if anything, I was more scared I may offend her. But, to my surprise, she turns her head, looking toward the outside scenery, hesitates, but then says, "Yes, I know some, and I've experienced it too." She proceeds to tell me a description on the apparent equivalent to a werewolf. To paraphrase, she said, "Werewolves look like normal people, but masked in white paint, covering their face, arms, and chest. Their whole body as white as a corpse, covered with black symbols, quite possibly related to devil worshipping. More specifically, they are grave diggers and necromancers as well. They dig bodies up only to steal jewelry, although they may perform other acts to corpses," as she quickly strayed away from going into too much detail about that. Werewolves also get their power from the devil. That is how they are able to possess such supernatural strength and endurance. I was surprised to hear this, although I figured werewolves wouldn't look anything like that in Twilight or Scooby-Doo maybe. Although deep down, even though I thought she sounded a bit crazy, before I could ask more questions about these werewolves, she began to tell me her own interaction with these supernatural beasts, and her story gives me chills. She explained that one day, her and her husband were driving on the curvy roads alongside the mountains, only to find a woman with her face covered by her hands and was kneeling in the middle of the road, appearing as though she was crying. The woman looks up towards the car's headlights to reveal the very same white paint and sacrificial symbols mentioned previously. Her husband honked his horn and quickly slams on the brakes, only to be too late, and hears the loud cracking sound of the woman's bones and the splash of blood all over the windshield. Once her and her husband stop the car safely and processed what the hell just happened, they quickly run over to the spot where they hit the woman. However, once they reached the spot, there was no body. But not only that, there was no trace of blood either. Just as a side note, this part of the res had some cliffs, but it was relatively flat land, so it would be obvious to tell where someone is. Especially if they just got hit by a car. Puzzled by what the possible explanation could be for this odd occurrence, her and her husband drove back home, trying to neglect the thought that they had just witnessed a werewolf. However, Being the non-paranormal believers they were at the time, they tried to just close this occurrence off as them just losing their minds. As interesting as her story was, this got me thinking, is it possible for this werewolf story to be true? Or is this her own way of describing a skinwalker or other supernatural phenomenon because she didn't think I knew what a skinwalker was? This question just kept circulating through my head. So as you could expect, the following nights made it harder for me to sleep comfortably. Because of that, during the workdays I would feel more and more mentally drained, almost paranoid. At the end of the week, around 6, I was sitting in the car, driving back to the church site, and was in a mental state of mind where I was half awake and half asleep. My buddy was driving, and he claimed that he wanted to pull over to the gas station that was near the church just to grab a couple of snacks to munch on during our debrief time in our cabin. Since I was too tired to argue, I said fine, and laid my face against the window and tried to doze off while waiting for my friend. However, I had the weirdest feeling that I was being watched. So naturally, I opened my eyes and looked out the window. I saw nothing. However, when I turned my head, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a white figure, just as the woman described previously. I looked back and nothing was there, but I swear I saw something. Since it was beginning to get darker outside, I quickly sat up in my seat to readjust my vision. But when I looked back out the window, it was almost as though the figure had vanished. Perplexed, I stepped outside the car and looked around, but there was no trace of a creature even existing. My buddy comes back to the car and questions what the hell I was doing, debating on whether or not I should tell him. I decided to just say, "Oh, I'm just getting some fresh air. Let's head out." The following days have been even worse for me. My mood is getting worse. I'm feeling way more paranoid that something is out there. And at night, I can almost swear that I hear a scream in the distance. Everything outside just looks 100 times scarier too, because there's barely any outside lights besides the moon. So everything has more of an exaggerated appearance. But believe me, I know I sound crazy. But the worst part is that if I tell anyone, they'll think I'm crazy too. So I've been debating whether or not I actually saw the werewolf that the lady described, or if it was just my tired eyes maybe playing tricks on me. I hope someone can find some sort of answer to this werewolf mystery. Also, if you have any similar paranormal stories like this, please share. I'm trying my best to be more aware about this, and if I find anything in the future, I will update you on my encounters or any other odd discovery. Hi, I just wanted to write into you about an experience I've had recently with these so-called dogmen. It's really changed my way I view the world, and nonetheless terrifying. I feel like once you run into these things, it draws them to you. This happened to me just back in spring, back when it was still pretty wet outside and hadn't really gotten hot just yet. I live out in a much more rural area of the world. We have roughly 94 acres surrounding us, full of timber, thick brush, and a big creek that runs throughout. I was on my way back one night from a friend's party to my house when I began to feel a strange feeling pulling up into my house. Now, quick note before I go into any further details. When I was a little kid, we had a poltergeist at the house I grew up at. A very aggressive poltergeist that caused a lot of harm to my parents and I. I remember I would always know when it was in the room with me because I could feel the evil presence of this thing. This is the same evil presence I felt around my house. I sat there in the car looking around. Things felt different. I wasn't quite sure what was going on, but whatever this was felt different. I slowly got out of my car and began walking towards the door, carefully. It was fairly dark outside, considering it had been long after sundown. I don't remember the exact time. Before my hand could reach the handle to put the key in, I heard a deep, low guttural growl. I froze in place, slowly looking over my shoulder in the direction that it came from. It was nothing like anything I had ever heard before, but it did sound canine-like. It reminded me of a huge wolf, especially after growing up in the woods and hearing various animal noises. The growl continued on for a few seconds. I was so scared I was fumbling with the keys. It really felt like I was dropped into an 80s horror film. I really did think I was going to die right there on the spot. I was sure any second the thing making this sound was going to pounce upon me and devour me whole, right where I stood. The growl sounded as though the creature was standing only feet away from behind my car. I refused to look out of fear of what I would see. It sounded so close. Whatever it was had to have been humongous. The bass alone in its growl, I could feel it throughout my entire body. I have never been so afraid. Until a few moments later, when I began to hear heavy, slow steps coming towards me. It was moving in quickly. I know because its strides had to have been enormous with how close it had gotten to me so quickly. By the time I plunged my keys in and had turned them and opened my door, this thing had to have been directly behind me. Once I was inside, I have no idea what was behind me because I simply never looked, and I refused to. I never heard any sounds the rest of the night. I've lived in this house for a few years now and haven't felt any weird feelings or seen anything out of the ordinary. I've tried to look online for anything, and everything seems to point me in the direction of what's called a Dogman, just based off the growling and the horrible feelings of fear. I wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary that night either. When I had left my home in the evening, all was fine and quiet, as it usually is. With 94 or so acres surrounding you, you often hear a lot of wildlife, and the occasional deer, but I've never felt anything like what I did that night. I've never seen anything weird out in the wilderness, nor have I heard anyone encountering anything strange. Like I said before, I lived at this property a few years, and we do get a lot of critters out here, but not what that thing was. There ain't nothing big enough out here to growl as loud as that thing sounded. I swear it could have been the size of a moose. Its presence alone terrified me. But what really scares me is how helpless I felt. It's like it was letting me know that it could have easily gotten me, and there is nothing I could have done. I felt like it left a mark on me. I don't know how to explain it. So, I was throwing some rotten tomatoes close to the tree line because I'm too lazy to walk down there and dump them. I threw one that came close to hitting the trees, and that's when I saw movement about 5 feet above the ground. Not really leaves or branches moving, more like a shadow moving, if that makes any sense. I stood completely still and just listened to what I thought was breathing. I thought maybe it was possibly wind doing something weird going through the leaves, but to me it sounded like breathing. I continued to stand there, focusing on the spot where the shadow had moved, and saw what looked like a pointy ear, not ears. I couldn't see the other half. First thought was that it looked like a big dog, but from what I could see, which wasn't much, I threw the final bad tomato in that direction, and saw the shadow move quickly back, followed by 2 to 3 heavy steps, and that's it. I just stood there thinking, nah, I'm just tired from work, go to bed. This happened about 4 weeks ago, shortly before my vacation. While on my vacation, I kept thinking about what the hell that was, and tried to do some quick research while relaxing poolside, and kept coming across Dogman sightings. Upon my return, Nothing more has happened. No shadows, no moving, no growling, or any other stuff people report when encountering this thing. I don't really know what to think. I'm hoping if it was something, it moved on. I work full-time and do a lot of side projects, and have kids in sports, so I'm pretty much a walking zombie. I still just can't shake that feeling that what I saw was just not my imagination. If anything, I will set up some game cams and I guess have some deer hunting and possibly an audio recorder. I know it's kind of lengthy, but I just needed to get this off my chest and maybe get some advice from anyone out there who has experienced something similar. If it was just me living here, I wouldn't really care about just one measly encounter, but my boys, they play outside, and I really wouldn't want anything to happen to them, knowing that something this size is potentially roaming around. I had stayed at my friend's place by Lansing for a couple of weeks and decided to take off and head towards the shore of Lake Michigan, up through Petoskey and over the Upper Peninsula. It was dark by the time I got to Pentwater, a small resort town on the shore of Lake Michigan in the western part of the state. I was kind of confused at a stop sign and lurched to a stop. Started and stopped. I looked up and there was a police officer stopped over to my right. I decided to make a right turn and then turn into a neighborhood. I made my way back to the main road and took a right. As I turned back on the main road, I saw a small hill going up into a wooded area on the left. I saw some sort of animal in the grassy area between the road and the trees. I thought to myself, oh cool, I'm going to see some wildlife, like a possum or a badger or something. But as I got near it, it seemed to move in a very unnatural way for an animal like that. Sort of too fast and too jerky as it ran to the side, and then down the hill. It appeared to be brown and reddish tobacco colored, and furry. It looked much larger, too. More like a human size. After I passed it, I looked up in my rearview mirror. The animal had stood up on its hind legs and ran across the street, leaning over with its front arms hanging down. Classic werewolf-type horror movie pose. I had been planning on camping out in that area, but now, no way. I drove over 2 hours before I stopped after that. I am an outdoorsman. I'm very experienced in hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival. I'm very familiar and used to all kinds of wildlife, and I was charged by what I believe was a cryptid called the Dogman. It charged me and my cousin. It was not a bear. A bear cannot move how it did, and it was not a normal wolf, as they can't comfortably run on 2 legs, whereas what charged us seemed natural at doing that. I can elaborate further if you wish. This happened back around June or July of 2007, I believe. I was around 17 years old and more cocky then, but still somewhat knowledgeable of the outdoors around me. My family used to own a cabin in northwestern Wisconsin. I basically grew up there in the summer. I knew the woods well, but at night it was wise to stay in the cabin, or at least by the bonfire by the beach, just because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One of the creepiest things was, if you were having a bonfire, the tree line was visible from the fire pit and beach, and at night, you always felt like you were being watched from that tree line. But during the day, the woods always seemed normal, not so creepy at all. That is, until this incident. So this happened somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. Me and my cousin were having an airsoft battle. I was in full woodland camo. He was not. I retreated onto the ATV trail into the woods for a tactical advantage, and our battle took us about 200 meters in, to about a third of the way up the trail. We had enough at this point and were standing at the edge of a clearing on the trail, talking, and he was maybe 10 feet from me, when I decided to mess with him. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." He froze. Then I realized the woods were dead quiet, and I got spooked and started scanning the tree line and the other edge of the clearing from left to right when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away. It was panting and staring at my cousin. I don't expect you to believe me, but what I saw was a wolf as big as a black bear, at least 300 pounds. But it wasn't normal. This wolf was on 2 legs, crouching next to a tree, with its arm grasping the tree, grasping with a clawed hand. It had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we have to go, and the next thing I know, he is sprinting, and I look back at Wolfie, who had locked on and sprinted a few steps on 2 feet, and then I turned and I ran, when it looked like Wolfie was dropping to all 4s. This thing charged us and sounded right on our asses, barreling through the brush. But for whatever reason, let us go when we broke out of the tree line and headed for the cabin. What stuck with me the most was the sheer size. Wolfie appeared to be nearly 7 feet tall when upright, and that where it should have had the front paws, it appeared to have large clawed hands. Now I'm not sure how to explain it away rationally. I have heard wolves will occasionally kind of walk upright, but as far as I know, they can't sprint on 2 legs. Nor do wolves even get that big. And black bears more waddle on 2 legs. The closest description is silly. A werewolf or dogman. Thank you for reading. Like, I believe my town has something like 247 people in it. Everybody knows everybody. Weird things have happened before, like animals being slaughtered or going missing, that sort of thing. Naturally, we chalked it up to coyotes or other critters. See, I'm an avid hunter, so I was heading out to the woods with my bow, a fully decked out Matthews Creed. I got out a little earlier than usual, so it was still pretty dark. I've never minded the woods before, so all I planned on doing was relaxing in my stand for a while, as I didn't feel like stalking today. It's not too far away from daylight, so the birds and other wildlife are starting to make their morning calls. Usually pretty peaceful, right? I swear to God, in the span of a second, everything in that patch of woods shut up at the exact same time. Dead silence. It didn't even try to be subtle. That alone scared the piss out of me. So naturally, my scared self froze and just listened for anything. My first thought was, oh shit, something's out here with me. Which freaked me out even more. Then I started to think maybe it was just a bear or a bobcat, which was still terrified to meet up with, but at least gave me a logical answer. I figured I could hear a bear coming, but I knew big cats were renowned for stalking people without their knowing, which scared the daylight out of me. I decided to keep moving towards my stand, post up, and just point my bow down the tree. After what seemed like forever, I freaking made it. I shuffled up the stand, pulled out my knife, just in case, and just listened. Dawn was definitely breaking now, which made me feel much better. Still though, no sounds of wildlife, which was getting more and more eerie by the second. Now, my stand is perched on the side of a creek. The creek wasn't very deep, like maybe to the top of your ankle. About the only sound I could hear was the slight noise of running water. Then I hear something to my right, and it is running fast. I instantly raise my bow and wait, shitting my pants in the moment. It's getting louder and louder and closer. I almost screamed when I saw this bastard. It literally looked like something out of the movie Dog Soldiers, only a little bit more muscular. This thing busted through the brush, ran down the slope, and through the creek. then disappeared on the other side. I've seen some stuff, let me tell you, but I was shaking like a newborn baby. I didn't ease off my drawstring for like 10 minutes, which, for those of you who don't know, is an incredibly long time to hold a bow, FYI. I mean, this thing was huge, like 6'5" to 7'5", 250 pounds of just no. And I've seen bears and the like before. They do not run like that. Anyway, after that, the sun really started to show and the birds began chirping again. I had calmed myself down after a while, so I noped out of there in a hurry. While I was terrified at the time, it's definitely going to be one of my coolest memories to look back on. I'm just going to move my stand and hopefully hunt elsewhere. My name is Ronald. I'm 20 years old and I live near a small town in Wayne County, West Virginia. My family and I originally lived in Jacksonville, Florida during my childhood, but we eventually moved up north because we couldn't handle the humidity and oncoming hurricanes. Now, what I'm about to tell you guys is 100% true, and I swear upon my life that what I've experienced is something I will never forget. It was last autumn, on August 27th, 2017, when my experiences first began. It was a Saturday evening, between 6:30 and 7:30 p.m., I think it was. I was driving home from taking an incredibly long drive. I drove from my home to the town of Wayne, then past Tulsa and Louisa, and finally as far as Chapmansville. I guess I drove way too far for my liking. Anyway, it was getting dark and eventually found my way home in the form of a road called 8th Street that led me to Mount Union Road. It was the road that took me straight to the house of one of my dad's friends, Ezra, where there was this road called Walnut Gap Road, and that was where it takes me home. Now, on this road, there's a blind curve next to an old, abandoned white church, in which I always slow down on before driving around the curve, just to make sure nobody was going to come flying around the corner that night. Now, right as soon as I do that, there's a 6-foot ledge on the left side of the road where some small trees have fallen over, whereas on the other side, there's a steep hillside that has a path cleared through the thick underbrush where deer like to hide in. And right at that same spot is where my first encounter happened. Just as I slowly drove around the corner, I saw this thing step onto the road on all fours. When I first saw it, I thought it was a 500-pound male black bear because it was roughly the same size as one, and we do tend to have a few roaming around where I currently live. But then I noticed that it was actually more like a wolf because it had a long, bushy tail and pointed ears and a canine-like snout, and the same body shape as a wolf with jet black hair and glowing amber-colored eyes. By the time it stepped out onto the road, the wolf had turned its head towards my direction and stared right at me. I was ecstatic at first to actually see a wolf in the wild, but at the same time I realized that there was something rather off about this thing, about my encounter. There shouldn't be a wolf out there this big. In fact, the more I think about it, there shouldn't even be any wolves out here in West Virginia anymore, since the timber wolves that once lived in these woods were killed off. Was the state government secretly using conservation efforts to repopulate wolves here in the state? Did a pack of wolves escape from a wildlife sanctuary and somehow found their way here? If so, then how did this get so freaking huge? Not only did the wolf's abnormal size catch my attention, so did the look in its eyes. They looked different from what I've seen in the eyes of any canine I know of. They looked much more intelligent than anything of any animal I've seen. Whatever theory I've had to support any rational explanation for this unusual sighting were immediately shot away when this creature did something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. Something that still haunts my very soul to this day. When we both stared at one another, even while I'm inside of my car, I heard what sounds like bones popping loudly, and to my absolute shock, I watched this wolf place its hand on top of my car hood, raise itself off the ground, and stand up on two legs. Yeah, you heard me right. It wasn't a paw it placed on my car hood. It was a hand. When the wolf stood up and my headlights hit it square on, that's when I got a really good look at this thing. It was easily 8 feet tall, easily, and weighed roughly around 600 to 650 pounds or more. As I said, it was covered in jet black hair that seemed quite feral in my opinion, as if it hasn't been cleaning himself that much. And it also had a long bushy tail and 2 glowing amber yellow eyes. To my shock, it was more than a wolf standing on its hind legs. It had a human-like torso from the waist up that appeared pretty muscular, with broad shoulders and long forearms, longer than those of normal human beings. I could see the muscles of this wolf man pulsating with each breath it took, especially with the headlights lighting it up. It also had these dexterous hands that looked almost like raccoon hands, but with more elongated fingers and long jet black claws at each fingertip. They looked like they could be used to easily manipulate any kind of prey in its clutches, and they looked like they could easily rip me to shreds. Or maybe they can do more than just that. The hind legs resembled more of those of a dog or a wolf. They were haunched. This I can easily tell you because they bent backwards and had these massive paws for feet, from the looks of which it was standing on its toes more than its feet. It had a massive head similar to that of a wolf or a large German shepherd, but much bigger in proportion, with pointed ears and tufts of fur at the tip of each ear, as well as a long muzzle with these great, big fangs gouging out at the front of its snout. To be honest with you, the fangs had a very eerie resemblance to those of a saber-toothed cat, but the rest of it just looked like a werewolf. But the eyes were the one thing, the only thing about my encounter that night that I'll never forget. And even writing about it to you all right now sends a bone-chilling fear down my spine. As I've said to you prior, the eyes looked extremely intelligent, far smarter than any animal I've come to know in my neck of the woods. But they also held a feeling that told me I was looking into the eyes of something that just spelled evil out of them. Finally, I gained this overwhelming sense of dread after seeing it walk to my side of the car on 2 legs, slowly bent down to level its eyes with mine, and I froze in pure, unadulterated terror when it used its hand to jiggle the door handle to try and open my car door. Fortunately, all the doors to my car were locked, and every window was closed. But this still horrified me to a point where I couldn't even breathe. This wolfman, as I previously referred to it as, gave out a grunt and actually frowned at me for a few seconds before standing back and walking to the other side of my car, and it jiggled the other door handle adjacent to the passenger side. Whatever this thing was, it was intelligent enough to know what a doorknob, or in this case, a door handle, is for. At this point, I was absolutely shaking in my seat with the same fear still latched onto my soul. Have you ever been through an experience in your life where, even though you've known all your life that you're an apex predator, you find yourself going out into the wilderness alone, and you suddenly feel so weak, so vulnerable, so helpless in the eyes of such a beast like this? That's exactly how I felt in the time of my encounter. I felt like this thing, a creature that shouldn't even exist, yet was standing right there in front of my car, was the true ruler of the forest, and we humans were nothing compared to what it can really do. It could have easily ripped the doors off my car and pulled me out. It could have caught up to me if I tried to escape, and even if I tried to scream for help, it wasn't going to help me because I knew how powerful this predator was, even if I didn't know it yet. Just by looking at the Wolfman, I knew a human being wouldn't have stood a chance, and I knew that it knew that I knew. I honestly thought I was going to die, that my family and my friends would never see me again, that they would never know what was happened to me, or how I was killed or eaten alive by something that nobody else believes exists, and that there was nothing I could do about it. However, none of that ever happened. It was as if God himself was watching over me that night, protecting me from the malevolent beast that was circling me. Instead of attacking me head on, the Wolfman bared its teeth at me and let out an extremely deafening snarl before walking around the front side of my car, crossing the road on its hind legs in just 2 steps. The encounter didn't end there, though. By the time it crossed the road, it paused for a couple of seconds before it slowly turned around to look at me one last time. As soon as it did that, I could have sworn right then and there that it wasn't alone. I looked over its shoulders, and I could see multiple pairs of eyes staring directly at me. I knew they were of the same creature as the first one because they held the same eye shine and gave off the same growls. I estimate that I saw at least 5 other pairs of eyes staring at me. 3 of them were low on the ground on all 4s. The other 2 were standing upright. But they didn't reveal themselves out of the darkness like the first one did. In my opinion, I think he might have been the alpha male of his pack. If you all think encountering one werewolf-like creature was terrifying enough, imagine how I felt when I saw there was more than one. With that scary thought, I snapped out of my trance and decided to get the hell out. I slammed hard on my accelerator, and I bolted away and drove out of there like a bat out of hell. I'm not pulling your leg here, but the distance from right where I was when I saw those things to my home, I literally arrived home and pulled into the garage in just 1 minute. By the time I arrived, I was in tears. I've never felt that scared before in my entire life, and not only that, that was the first time I've cried that much in a long time. My parents were concerned about the state I was in, and asked me what had happened. I basically told them everything that transpired just before I pulled in. Now, I may have made up different stories and stuff before, but that was only when I was little, and whatever I've experienced wasn't a joke. I told them the whole truth with honesty, but terror in my voice. But, of course, they didn't believe me. They just assumed what I saw could have been a black bear, and driving after dark like that makes your mind play tricks on you. But this wasn't a trick I saw. I was 19 at the time, but I respected the DUI, so I wasn't drunk while driving home that night. I wasn't dreaming off this incident, nor was I hallucinating it. It wasn't even a simple misidentification. I know what I saw, and there's no doubt in my mind that it was real. After this encounter, it's affected me so much that I was forced to isolate myself from everybody I know, including my family and friends, for a little over a month or 2, but I eventually broke out of my shell and got back into my social life again. However, I took this time to do some intense research on what I saw, and that's when I came upon the Dogman phenomenon for the first time. According to several eyewitness testimonies, people have reported seeing the exact same creature all over the US and even in some remote parts of the world. This in turn filled me with relief, knowing that I wasn't alone, that there are people out there who swear on their lives, and even to this day, and what they saw out there were real. They're not a haunting part of humanity's imagination, like we all believe them to be. Monsters do exist in this world, and this fact alone makes us realize how small our world really is. To me, it makes me wonder that if a pack of werewolf-like creatures can exist, then what else could be out there lurking in the shadows, watching us with intelligent eyes, waiting for us to prove their existence in man's world. So, this is the first time I'm actually sharing this experience with anyone, and it's taken me quite a while to be able to tell it, because ever since it happened, I haven't been the same. I don't sleep as well, I have constant nightmares, and have been generally getting more ill, and just being traumatized. My brother as well, with whom it occurred. Last summer in July, I was visiting my brother, who happens to live in northern Michigan, in a town called Rapid City. The place itself is pretty close to the Traverse State Forest area, in which a long road runs through it, called Supply Road. This road has thick forests and brush on both sides with occasional farms. We had went down south to a lake which is only about a 30-minute drive from where he lived at the time. He wanted to show me around the area and the lake itself and have some fun with photography. It was about 9 p.m. when we finally decided to call it a day, and it was pretty dark at this point anyway. On the way back, we're both like, fuck it. Let's drive through the Traverse State Forest area for a more scenic route, even though it is out of the way. We both loved the woods and going through scenic routes, and I loved getting to see new parts of Michigan. As we pulled onto Supply Road, it didn't seem more than 7 or so minutes before we had our experience with whatever the hell it was we saw. Going north on this road, on the left side of the road is about 10 or so feet of clearing, with just dirt and grass before it gets thick brush and trees. It was a little after 9 p.m. at this point, and as we're driving, since I'm in the passenger seat, I noticed this large black-like dog on the side of the road. But something wasn't right. It looked like it was crouched down, just as a human being would, waiting to jump out or something. It wasn't looking over in our direction, but you could tell its head was absolutely canine-like. As we got closer, and the lights actually started to shine on it, it immediately turned its head towards and stood up, as it made this horrible hissing sound. I don't know how else to describe it. Both my brother and I turned sheet white at this point, and had slammed on our brakes. About 30 feet away from us on the side of the road standing was this, I don't even know what to call it. I want to say werewolf because that's the only thing that really describes what it looked like. Maybe it was a skinwalker. I don't know. This beast had piercing, sharp yellow eyes that for some reason didn't reflect at all when the lights hit them, but they just almost seemed to glow on their own, which was creepy in and of itself. This thing had a longer snout and very pointed ears and was massive. When it hissed at us, you could see how sharp and massive its teeth were and how fast it stood up and scared us both, as we had startled this thing. It honestly looked like something out of a horror movie, and if CGI actually looked real. We had our windows rolled down the way home, and we smelled what I can only describe as if you mixed garbage, decayed flesh, and wet dog together. We didn't really smell it until after it had stood up, and we had slammed on our brakes. This thing was about 8 or 9 feet, I would say, with a humongous build. This thing wasn't bulky per se, but it was big, and was extremely lean. It looked like an extremely masculine and lean human male body. I didn't see any genitalia. This thing was very shaggy and hairy, with finger-like claws, like pretty much you'd see in a typical werewolf movie. I didn't get a chance to stare at the feet or anything, as I was motionless, staring. We only got to stare at it for what seemed like a few seconds before it let out this horrible scream that shook me and my brother to the core. It immediately started to pace towards our truck aggressively, with its claws outstretched and baring its teeth, as if ready to kill. Me and my brother screamed at the top of our lungs, and he floored it as hard as he could. He literally sped all the way home, and we didn't say a word the rest of the way. We didn't sleep at all that night, and I haven't been the same person ever since. What I saw that night terrified me so bad, and I'm sharing this with people because I hope they can educate themselves and know what's out there. If you do encounter this, get help, and don't fear or worry about people ridiculing. This is something that happened to my husband and I a good 9 or so years ago. We had gone to watch a friend's band play and were headed home from downtown Dallas. I don't live in the metropolitan any longer, so not personal info. It was around 1 in the morning, but we still had plans before I was expected home. So we headed to his apartment in one of the South Dallas suburbs. This is a pretty well-populated suburb, but by the time we got close to his apartment, the roads were pretty much empty. We exited the highway and turned onto the street that led to his apartment. But as soon as we passed the traffic light under the highway, we both saw it, plain as day. Stone cold sober and wide awake, we both saw a mother effing werewolf type creature exit a neighborhood street and calmly run in about 4 steps across a 4-lane road. It was about 75 yards in front of us, but it wasn't exactly the way I'd imagine a werewolf. It was entirely canine. No human features at all, except for the fact that it was on 2 legs. The legs were massive, and the thing was about 7 feet tall, but the arms reminded me of a T-Rex. They were small and clung to the dog, or creature. They seemed very useless if the thing were trying to attack something. The head was also odd, besides being a typical dog color, so grayish-black. The eyes were bright, glowing yellow, even when there weren't headlights shining directly in them. It didn't look like the glow an animal gets from lights in their eyes anyway. But the thing that stood out to me the most was that the eyes were biocular, like a fish. I saw the eyes clearly, even though he was completely profiled to us. The road we were driving on had heavy trees to the right-hand side of us. When it came out, it was running, but crossed this road in just a few steps. It was big enough and effortlessly fast enough to know that a human couldn't have dressed up and done this. There was an open field that it ran into. When my husband and I got to where the trees broke, we both turned our heads to look, but it was long gone by then. I think the only thing that was said was a quiet, "What the hell?" by me. More about what this thing looked like, though. It was more menacing than you could ever imagine. But to be honest, much less scary than what I would imagine a werewolf to look like. When it was running across the road, I didn't get the sense that it cared that we stopped, or that it was even trying that hard to cross before we got closer. I didn't feel fear as if we were threatened. Only a disbelief, really. And again, it's not like we were in a rural area by any stretch of the imagination. When we passed the tree line, his apartment complex was literally another 150 yards or so up the road. We hurried in and didn't exactly get to our plans. We basically just sat there in silence, trying to rationalize, I guess. Still to this day, I often think to myself, I mean, really, did this really happen? But as soon as I close my eyes and I think about it, those bright yellow eyes are still there, and they will never go away. I lived in a cottage in the woods in central Sweden for a few years, and late one night in the spring, I went outside to get firewood and heard something terrible. Growling, snarling, barking, gnashing of teeth. Something tearing through underbrush, snapping trees. I hadn't seen the movie at the time, but it was like the troll from the Norwegian film Troll Hunter. I grabbed my hatchet and ran downhill to the middle of my front yard to activate the motion-sensing floodlights that cast light across the whole yard and across the field to the woods on the far side, maybe 50 to 75 meters away. The sounds quieted, then resumed and increased in intensity, with roars and growls and more destruction. I saw saplings shake along the edge of the woods as whatever it was approached. I slid my hand up the hatchet head so I would be ready to strike in a panic, rather than using a more powerful and effective grip at the base of the handle. I also prepared to run back to the house. All of a sudden, a gray thing streaked out of the woods, loudly snarling. It was headed in a wide arc for the barn where the light was mounted. I started backpedaling, still gripping the hatchet tightly. It moved so fast I could hardly react. Within 2 of my steps, it had crossed the field, jumped a ditch, and passed between me and the barn, raced alongside it. It then crashed into the double-layered chicken wire fence of the chicken farm and disappeared behind the barn. I could hear more snarling and growling and underbrush noises as it continued on its rampage, further and further away. Then I noticed another similar source of noise in the woods, where this one came from, moving through the woods on an interception course to the first monster thing. It, too, faded into the distance. How big was this thing? About as big as a medium to small dog. Its diminutive size compared to the volume and pitch of the sounds it was making was a huge surprise. In the poor lighting situation I had, it was very difficult to tell anything about the color, but I think it was mainly gray, with maybe a little bit of brownish tint. Hello. This is a 100% real encounter that I had one night. The encounter to this day still freaks me out a little bit, albeit the experience was short. This took place in Loma, California. It happened about 13 years ago, when I was 17. I lived near a forested area, near a highway above a hill. I was never the type to be scared easily. I'm not religious or superstitious, or anything like that to start things off. I generally keep to myself, and I always describe myself as a strong, silent type. I tend to notice environmental changes in my surroundings more than most people and keep on my own toes. Anyway, the experience was short and occurred roughly at 2 a.m. at night. It happened in front of my house while most people were sleeping. I, being the nocturnal person I am, decided to go in front of my house and run laps back and forth from my house back to the chain link fence that went up the hill. It was about 100 feet back and forth, and I normally ran about 50 of these laps before I'd go back in. It wasn't a full moon that night. In fact, from what I remember, it was pitch dark, and there was an eerie feeling in the air. There was livestock in the area, and coyotes would come around once in a while, and I was familiar with all the sounds of the night, or so I thought. During my quick exercise routine, I was suddenly stopped by a sound that still sends chills down my spine to this day. I heard what sounded like a low pitch, but the source indicated that the animal making the sound was big and wolf-like. It struck me with fear and dread as I stopped running completely, cowering behind the car on the driveway. I thought perhaps it might have been a horse that resides around the property, making a weird noise, but then I heard it again, below the hill in the darkness. No, this was not a horse or wild pig, nor a coyote, at least to my knowledge. The sound of this low, bloodlusted growl was unlike anything I had ever heard, and I felt like it was targeting me. I normally do not feel scared, but in that moment, I couldn't muster any courage to take a peek down the hill. An instinct within me said do not do it, or you would regret it. I heard it again, and I knew it was aware of my presence. I was so curious to know where the sound was coming from, but the other part of me said to run towards the house and hide in your room. I felt the instinct to save myself was greater than curiosity, so I backed towards my door and hid in my room until daylight. I told the story to people, and they didn't believe me, or that I let my imagination run wild. But I know that whatever it was, it made me feel real fear, and that feeling doesn't happen to me often. A year or two later, I watched a movie that I felt really recreates the sound well, An American Werewolf in London. I still get nightmares just thinking about the sound it made. I know that it wasn't a farm animal or a coyote. Otherwise, I'm sure I'd have overcame my fear to get closer and examine the sound, but I know I'll never know for sure. So, when I was younger, 16 or 17 I think, I had an encounter with something strange in the forests near Danbury, Wisconsin. Background on me is that I'm 6'4" and athletic. I'm a hunter, camper, and martial artist. Generally, a survivalist. I was naive and didn't give nature the proper level of respect, and basically was a cocky teenager who felt invincible. Our cabin had been on Long Lake in Wisconsin. The whole area is forested for the most part. I was there on vacation with my cousin and grandparents. It was a nice and hot summer day, and we had decided to play airsoft. At the time, I took airsoft very seriously. I wore a full BDU Woodland with a camouflage mask even. My cousin just wore jeans and a shirt. We had a battle which I took into the woods where I felt comfortable. We were about 150 meters into the forest when we stopped. Then I decided to tease my cousin. I shushed him and said, "We're being watched." Jokingly, of course. Unfortunately, it turned out to not be much of a joke, because I immediately then noticed that the woods were dead quiet, which only happens when a large predator is around. I was on edge very quickly. Next, the feeling of being watched. I started scanning the surrounding area. Then, I saw it. The whitish teeth gave it away. What I saw was at the edge of a clearing about 40 meters from us, crouched and holding onto the tree with its left hand. It was panting and watching us with its ears up. It had reddish-brown hair and looked canine-like. In my head, it clicked as a werewolf. I said to my cousin, "We have to go," and he bolted. I still had my eyes on it when my cousin started sprinting. The creature then charged, but it ran on two legs for maybe 10 feet, then dropping to all fours. I turned and sprinted. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind us. Once back at the cabin, we discussed it, but it's still unclear if my cousin saw it. I told him I thought it was a bear, not to freak him out, but I know bears. It wasn't a bear. I started doing research on these things after my encounter, which brought me to many Dogman-related websites and forums. What I saw coincides with other people's sightings. I am now far better about respecting nature, and I am extremely cautious with forests. If I go into nature alone, I'm always armed, but I prefer to not be alone. Remember, those that are listening, always trust your senses. I met my best friend Ben when I was only 19. We started a degree in music together and had absolutely nothing in common, which we loved about each other. What shocked us was how in sync our childhoods had been. From being born 2 weeks apart to the age of 12, we shared a lot of experiences, even though we never met. I remember him telling me about a VHS he used to have with Huxley Pig and Quack Quack cartoons on it, saying how obscure it was and how I'd love it. I replied that I knew exactly which VHS he was referring to, and also still had a copy of it. This sort of thing happened a lot between us, so we liked to quiz each other from time to time. One night, when I was staying over at his house, we got on the topic of kids' ghost stories. I love creepy stories, but Ben hates them, so the conversation was slow. We started the usual stories, and the neighborhood spread. It was funny how many of our own town stories were actually the same for being opposite sides of the city and river, 10 miles from each other. The dilapidated places were always haunted. We had both heard about a one-eyed black cat nobody owns that watches kids play outside. The list of stories went on and on, as did the similarities. Ben got surprisingly into the discussion. "So have you ever heard of this one story?" etc. To which I confirmed or told my town's slightly different version of the story. That's how the night progressed. After we exhausted the conversation, he ended with, "Even to this day, I'm still scared of Dogman. So please tell me you've heard about that." I profoundly remember being dumbfounded, saying I had no idea what Dogmen were. As far as I'm aware, the Dogman story is just in Ben's town. We tried looking on the internet, but Ben was too easily freaked out by pictures and scary stories that popped up as we searched. The Dogman phenomenon really grabbed my attention. Usually kids' ghost stories go into so much detail, like the color of the ghost's dress, or the exact way the hair hangs over the ghost's eyes. But there wasn't much information about Dogman. Details were vague. His words at the time were something like, "The older kids who were allowed out in the street told us about Dogman watching them, who stood around in the alleys at night, and the older kids were shamelessly scared to go when it got dark." Obviously it was thugs or druggies, I explained. But he was adamant. No, because they ran away when they noticed the kids watching them. They'd climb up the high walls of the back alley into people's backyards, really fast, without ever making a noise. The older kids wouldn't talk about it, unless pushed. He said their feelings seemed too real to make it a joke. His childhood friend Wes claimed to have saw them too. The story goes that Dogman would be found standing in small groups, or more often solitary, in the middle of an alley, looking for scraps of food, or better yet, for young children to eat. Ben seriously thinks he saw one with his mom one day walking back from stores. Apparently it was in a fenced-off area where a block of flats had been demolished only a few years before. At the opposite side of this land, he saw a skinny, hunched-back man cupping his hands full of water from the stream, which ran through the plot, washing his long, greasy hair, almost ritualistically. Even though he didn't seem homeless, his face was quite far away to make out any details, but he swears something about the man wasn't human. I blame the child's imagination and exaggerated memories, but he swears it. He showed me the area that next morning. If he and his mother remember correctly, I have no idea why a homeless man would ever be around that area. I first met Wes a few weeks after the night I learned about Dogman, and didn't hesitate to ask for his first-hand account of it. It was the main reason I decided to meet him after all. His description was similar to Ben's, but his encounter was far more close up. Wes lived further from the local corner shop than Ben, and used to take a shortcut through an alley where he walked. The wheelie bins were out that day. He said he could hear a cat or dog or feeding on something discarded behind the bins. It happens a lot, and everybody knows to keep a distance so the dog won't get aggravated and attacked. But Wes said the dog didn't look right. He only got a quick glance before it ran behind a wall with a rotten roast chicken hanging out of its mouth. According to his memory, it was running more like a hyena than a normal dog, with its shoulders held much higher than its hips. The snout was too short, and the ears were more elven than a dog's. He can't remember if the creature had fur or not, but it definitely was more naked looking. Not long after, he overheard the older kids talking about Dogman, and realized what he saw. I like Wes. He has a doubting attitude akin to mine, and admitted his memory may have been influenced by the other kids' stories. It could have just been a normal dog struggling to carry a whole chicken away after being startled. The story lay dormant and not mentioned for months after I spoke to Wes. In that time I had moved away and had only managed to visit Ben 3 times since. The last time I met with him we decided to go to the local takeaway in the early hours of the morning, and I got my very own encounter of what could have been a dogman. Right on the same abandoned plot where Ben saw the homeless man bathing, there was a decent-sized fire burning. I can make out possibly 3 silhouettes huddled around the flames. Ben's area is pretty rough, so this isn't an unusual sight, but I don't know how to describe it. Those figures weren't moving naturally. My view wasn't great because Ben wouldn't move closer than we were, but I swear those silhouettes never stood completely upright. We watched them for about 5 minutes. They were hunched over with their backs to us, warming their gloved hands by the fire with their hoods up. I remember one of them moving closer to the fire while keeping its hands on the ground. It would have been easier to just stand and walk closer, but it shuffled awkwardly, using its arms. Everything about their movements were indescribably awkward. I was so excited. It had to have been the dogman. I didn't want them to spot us, so we left pretty soon after, but I forced Ben to visit the bonfire with me the next day. There was just a milk crate sat next to a charred circle on the ground. Nothing to prove these beings were inhuman. Strangely, there were bones amongst the smoldering papers and branches that had been burning the night before. We could make out sooty handprints where at least one of the persons had presumably crawled directly over the charred ground. The trail of handprints led away from the bonfire and faded after a couple of meters. That was all that was found. We walked away feeling slightly silly, laughing at how we had probably been stalking a trio of drunk tramps. However, Ben's realization unnerved us terribly. As the hand trail faded, he pointed out a large paw print becoming more and more prominent in the middle of fading handprints. Then it struck me why I found their gait so weird the night before. As the man had walked closer to the fire, he placed his feet in exactly the same spot where his hands had been. We stared in shock, not sure what to make of the trail. Then the yelps and growls of dogs fighting came from a bush uncomfortably close to us. I'm not ashamed to say we ran away. Maybe it was just a pack of dogs, I don't know. We didn't care to look, and I'm never going back there to find out. I know these sets of encounters and stories don't match the typical dogman encounter, but I still thought these events would be interesting to share, as they might shed some light on the whole dogman phenomenon. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. I was 9 years old when this happened. At this point, I still shared a room with my sister, and so my bed was on one wall with a big window on the opposite side. My sister's bed was right underneath that window. We were on the first floor of the house, but we live on a hill, so it's slanted and it's still pretty high. Anyway, I woke up one Saturday night, feeling really thirsty. It was about 2 or so in the morning, and everyone else in my family was asleep. I was about to crawl out of my bed to go to the bathroom just down the hall, when I looked at the window and froze. At the very bottom of the window, there was a really dark shape. It looked kind of like the top part of a Siberian husky's head. It was a big thing with 2 points that looked like ears on the top. I couldn't make out any other features, so while I was still scared, I just thought it was a reflection of the pillows at the end of my sister's bed. Then it moved. You know how dogs kind of twitch their ears and perk them up when they're trying to hear better? That's what this shape did. The 2 points that I took for ears twitched and then came back into place. And it wasn't subtle movement at all, so I knew it just wasn't a reflection. The whole dogman story is really big here, and we live right in the woods, so I immediately thought of that. I got really scared, so I did the typical kid thing and pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep without ever getting my water. In the morning, there was nothing outside the window. No marks on the side of the house, nothing. No evidence that there had ever been something there at all. The thing that really stumps me is wondering how anything would manage to stay up by a window that's 9 feet off the ground in the first place. Since I was 9, I do accept that it was possible, I just imagined it. I already knew the Dogman stories, so maybe I was just scared to begin with, and that fear kind of manifested itself. At the same time, I really do believe that there was something outside my window. Dogman or not. This happened to me on July 2nd, 2015. While scanning the valley floor for sheep, a mile from my house, I noticed 2 loping figures. Initially, I thought the figures were coyotes or stray dogs, but as the 2 figures neared an old, sunken vehicle, I realized that the things were about the size of the vehicle itself, nearly 8 feet long. No animal could be that big on the reservation. I watched the 2 figures until they disappeared into the woods, across the valley. It was starting to get dark, but the moon was bright enough, so I walked without a light. As I walked down the mountain, I heard something yelling. It was like a howl or a yell. I started to hurry, and then, when I got to my house, I locked the door and spent the night listening to the strangest sounds. I'm sure it was a Dogman. This happened to me last winter, and I haven't seen this creature since. I'm not quite sure if this thing moves around or possibly even migrates from area to area. I can say it's a predator I didn't know existed, and I keep a very close eye on my surroundings now, no matter where I go. Where I live is about 10 miles out of town. I have several old fields around my house from where the last people who lived here had horses and other livestock. Beyond the fields are woods, and these woods go on for miles. And if you go back far enough, the land goes down into a creek that runs along the area. There's a lot of deer out here too, mostly does, but you do see the occasional buck or 2 from time to time. Like I said, mostly all doe. In fact, I pretty commonly see the same 20 or so doe that lives in the area about all the time. They bed down under a tree not far from my house out in the field. To give a little more detail about my house, it's a little older and larger, so it takes a lot to heat up, especially in the winter. In fact, because of where our wood stove is, it's not uncommon for us to go through 5 or so cords of wood every winter, and that's counting November to March. So we always try and prepare our wood well. Normally, since we have so much wood, I have a wood splitter set up in my woodshed, so I can do all my splitting and stacking right there. Once I get enough wood split and stacked, I try and keep the wood holder that's right in front of my house stocked full, so I don't have to make long trips out to the woodshed every time I need to put a log on the fire. I think this is a pretty common thing for most people who have wood stoves, rely primarily on wood stove heating. In the morning, before I leave for work, I usually try and have my wood holder outside my front door, full of wood for my wife, so she doesn't have to go into our shed. But this particular morning, I was running late, and I can't remember why. My wife had to make do with the small wood that was there, which was left over from the day before, and so it wasn't until I got home that evening that I got an earful, and I had to go out and make sure that she had plenty of wood for the following day, which was my bad. I usually like to keep it filled up just for her. It was dark out since I get home closer to 6, and I was going to grab some split wood and fill up our wood holder. I remember stepping outside my house and noticing the air feeling different. Do you know the feeling that when a thunderstorm approaches and the air feels heavier? That's how it felt, except it was January and it was frigid outside. I thought it was weird but quickly brushed it off and walked my way to the shed. As I'm in the shed, I'm grabbing some pieces of wood to put into the holder. I begin to get a bad feeling, like someone or something was hiding up beside my shed and was waiting for me to walk out so they could attack me. I keep a knife in my pocket, but with my arms full of a bundle of wood, I wasn't going to offer much of a fight. I felt nervous. I wasn't sure why I was feeling this. We've lived here for years, went through the same thing every winter, been out to the shed and back 1,000,001 times, never had a problem. In fact, the only predators we've ever seen around these parts are coyotes, and maybe a bobcat here or there. Our neighbors are so far away that we never even see them, and I don't ever have anybody just wandering up my driveway knocking on my door. I've never felt uncomfortable any time where I live. At the time, the feeling was so intense, I honestly imagined somebody walking up my driveway planning to hurt me and my family. I tried to brush those thoughts aside and tried to forget about the feeling I had. I walked at a brisk pace back to my front porch to begin loading up the wood holder. As I'm crouched down stacking the wood, the feeling of dread intensifies. What's worse is at this point, my back is completely against the woods and woodshed. I'm defenseless right now, a thought that would not escape me. It only took a moment or two for me to stack the wood in the holder before I turned around and stepped off my porch, only to stop right in my tracks. In my direct line of sight were these glowing yellow eyes staring at me from one of the trees close by the woodshed. I could just barely make out the silhouette of something very large behind the tree, with what looked to be a hand holding onto the tree for support. It was pretty dark outside, but my porch light shone enough where I could make out very minimal details. I remember as soon as I saw those eyes, I noticed the shape of tall ears. I stood there in place, frozen, and this thing, not even a couple seconds later, hides back behind the tree. It was watching me. I felt like I was in danger, so I ran inside my house and grabbed my pistol. My wife was wondering why I was pale and had run inside so quickly, grabbing my gun. I explained to her there's a large animal or something outside, and we need to stay inside and be quiet. I was terrified at that moment, but looking back, I think it was more because of the unknown at the time. Anyway, I waited inside for a few hours for this thing to be gone and courageously had made my way back outside to grab some more wood, since we were just about out of all the wood inside that we had. As soon as I stepped outside, the feeling was lifted. It was closer to 9 or 10 p.m. at this point. The woods were quiet, and the air felt normal again. Things were calm. I wasn't taking chances, though, and I remember I had never stacked wood so fast in my life after that. I quickly filled up our outside wood storage. The rest of the night was uneventful. The following morning, I was curious to see if there'd be any tracks in the dirt. And keep in mind, it hadn't snowed yet. So I walked out to where I saw this thing standing behind the tree. There was nothing. No signs of nothing. The dirt below didn't even look disturbed. I was confused and began to think I was going crazy. Things did calm down after that, and for the next week, everything was normal, as I recall. I want to say it was the following weekend where I took my wife out to dinner and a movie. As we're pulling back up in the driveway, our headlights shine on the largest black wolf I have ever seen in my life. We're about 3/4 the way up our driveway, just as we're pulling into our house, and this large wolf walks right past our house into the field. It looked right over at us and even looked disfigured. I've never seen a wolf like that. It looked like it came from a toxic waste dump or something, or deformed even. My wife was screaming. This thing, I kid you not, was easily the size of a buffalo. It was utterly massive. My wife was panicking and quickly ran into the house. I didn't know what to think, to be honest, so I just kept my pistol at my nightstand, ready in case this thing tried to break into the house. This is where things changed. The following nights, we began to hear howling off in the distance. We've heard packs of coyotes hollering and whooping off in the distance before, but this was different. This was powerful howling. So powerful you can feel the vibrations. It was so loud, and we'd hear bizarre animal noises outside of our house sometimes at night. Everything from tapping, clicking, shuffling, rustling, you name it. It felt like our house was being walked over by something. One morning, my wife came running in the house in hysterics because she was walking down to the mailbox to check the mail, since our mailbox is all the way at the end of our driveway, and she said that huge black wolf that we saw nights ago was standing on 2 legs in the driveway, growling at her, walking towards her. She began screaming and crying and ran back into the house. She was frantic and was begging me to grab my gun, worried that this thing was headed right to our house at this very moment. I went to grab my pistol, but as I picked it up from my nightstand, the realization that this thing would only tickle this animal. And in that very moment, I felt like some wounded prey that was about to be eaten. I glanced outside to see if maybe I could see it somewhere, but I didn't see it anywhere outside. My wife basically went and hid for the rest of the day, too scared to even be out. And I never heard or saw that thing outside. I didn't go outside looking though. It's possible it could have been an ambush, waiting to happen, but I'm not sure. Things continued and continued to get worse. I would find mutilated deer carcasses in my front yard. In fact, one time while coming home from work and driving up my driveway, there was a deer carcass right in the middle of the driveway. It looked like it had a few limbs ripped off, and it was disemboweled gruesomely from the view I had in my driver's seat with my headlights right on it. I had a bad feeling, like this animal had been purposefully killed and left here, knowing I would have to get out and move it so I could drive through, making me vulnerable just long enough to get me. This thing thought intelligently, and it really scared me. I just drove around the carcass over the side slopes of the driveway. I truly felt trapped. This animal, whatever it was that I had never seen before, had been tormenting us for reasons I will never know. Those were the major events that happened. Things continued like this for a while. Finally, around March-April time, things finally started quieting down. We hadn't noticed, but the deer had actually disappeared from that area entirely the past few months over the winter, which really never happens. We realized that when we saw much of the deer come back to the area around springtime, we hadn't had any weird feelings and things got back to normal for the most part. I apologize for this being so long, but I just can't quite put my finger on what kind of animal would do such a thing. My wife and I are still baffled alone at the fact that this creature can exist. If any one of you out there has any information on what we might have been dealing with, please let us know. I mentioned earlier we hadn't seen this thing since February or March, and are glad that it seems like it left the area. We've lived here for years now, and have never encountered something as unusual as this. However, with winter approaching again, we're not sure if this animal will show back up. That is something that truly worries me. Spring of 2012. My wife and I are driving back from visiting family. The drive to get them is quite long, like 8 or so hours, and so it's pretty early on in the AM. I'd say maybe 2 in the morning. We were only an hour or so away from home at the time. We're coming up to a bend in the road when our headlights illuminate this wolf-like creature, crouched down on the side of the road, just staring off. I noticed a wolf-like face with pointed ears. My wife was asleep, and I remember gasping and swerving the car as far away from this thing as I could. It was rather large. I would estimate it to be around 8 feet tall, if not even taller. The sudden swerving of the vehicle woke my wife up and had her asking me what the hell I was doing. I told her that there was some huge animal on the side of the road and I didn't want to hit it. Thankfully, my wife never had to see it. Then. Fast forward almost 9 months later, a and now we're in winter. And my wife and I are coming home again from going out from running errands or something. I can't quite remember, but I remember we were out all day because it was roughly 8 p.m. at night. I remember it was maybe around 8 p.m. or so, but since it was winter and it gets dark early, my perception of time might be a little off. Anyway, at this point, we're in an entirely different area of town where I saw the last wolf thing. The way we were coming back to the house, you have to go through about a 2-mile stretch of this more lone, straight road, with lots of wood and brush on one side, with the other side being more open, undeveloped land. We're driving this road, hadn't been on it for maybe a minute, and this large black shape runs out of the brush on our left behind us and chases our car. My wife and I both panic, and I floor the car. As I'm gaining speed rapidly, this thing catches up to our vehicle and then darts off back into the brush. My wife is freaking out. I'm freaking out. This was some werewolf-looking creature chasing our car. I should note that there were streetlights on this road, so there my wife and I got a decent look at this being, even though it only chased our vehicle for probably 30 seconds at most. I'll describe it for you. It was black and looked really shaggy. It had a wolf-like face and snout, and larger teeth. I didn't see anything with the eyes or really much else. It also looked different from the wolf creature I saw 9 months prior to driving home. Similar, but different looking. The wife and I try to forget about it as best we can. We have to take that long stretch of road anytime we want to go a specific way into town. Fortunately for us, we haven't encountered it since that event. I was about 15 when this happened to me and my friend. I'm 32 now, so this was quite a while back. We were out on his father's property, shooting off pellet guns, thinking we were badass. Practicing our aim, actually, if I remember right. We had quite a few old Folgers cans we had sitting at the top of old fence posts, and we tried to see who could shoot them from the farthest point away. This was all dandy and fun, and we were having a great time. This was in July, so it was hot as balls outside. I remember because I had a couple of cigs on me at the time, and had the thought that I didn't want to light one out there because all of the tall, dead grass could ignite. See, out where he was, he had a lot of fields around him with a lot of grass that was unkempt, and fire season usually got pretty bad. Anyway, after about an hour of us doing this, I told my friend that nature was calling, and so I walked into the nearby forest that's surrounding the entire property where we were shooting off of our pellet guns. I walked in, maybe no more than 100 feet, to the base of the tree, and started pissing. I'm almost done going to the bathroom, and I sense that somebody is looking at me. I glance over to my right, and to my horror, not even 20 feet away from me, is a monster straight out of a Hollywood movie. A werewolf. Except it was scarier than I ever could have imagined. This thing was hulking. It looked like someone took the head of a wolf and stuck it on a hairy bodybuilder. This werewolf's head was massive, like the size of a lion's. It stared at me right in the eyes, and I saw just how smart this thing was. It's like it realized that I realized it existed, and it was what it was. It did something next that's even hard for me to talk about, because it scares me so bad. This thing gave me the evilest grin. Yes, it smiled at me. Think of how when you watch the movie How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and all the evil faces that he would make that would scare you. It was like that. This creature was so intelligent that it grinned at me, like it had me all alone to itself, and was going to rip my guts out and eat me, and I knew there was nothing I could do about it. I got an overwhelming feeling this thing wanted to hurt me. I had never felt pure evil like that in my life. This thing was jet black and had piercing amber-colored eyes, and the biggest teeth I've ever seen on any animal. It began to extend its arms towards me, and took a couple of steps, and I ran so fast out there, back into the field where my friend is shooting off the pellet gun. I didn't even stop. I just yell at him to get back into the house now. My friend, confused, accepted my motion and ran back to the house with me. When we got back to the house, he was freaking out, wondering what was going on and what happened. He could tell I was out of breath, pale, and shaken up. I tried to explain to him what had happened and what I had seen. He would quickly glance behind me and around, and he kept checking back, and said he never saw anything following him or us the entire time. I honestly don't know what it is I saw, but I never want to be around it again. Funny enough, only months later, me and him would go back to that same property to do some hunting, hiking, and all the above, and we never encountered anything beyond the ordinary. It was only that one event, which is strange. Oddly enough, as the years would go by, I kept in contact with this friend. In fact, not even that long ago, him and I had a discussion about reminiscing on old times, and he told me other weird things would happen on that property. He said one that really freaked him out in particular was that he would hear these really loud metal scraping noises off in the distance. Now, his father owns about 200 acres of forest game land all around their property, and beyond that is state-owned game land. So there is nothing but miles and miles of middle-of-nowhere woods and forest surrounding him. There is no reason loud metal scraping should be coming anywhere near the forest or near his house. He told me it really spooked him. I saw something years back when I was visiting the Buck Shoals State Park. It's a tradition of my friends and me that every year we like to go hiking around the park. Summer and fall is the time of the year that we try and go, just because that's kind of our best availability. In fact, one of our favorite spots to hit in the park is the Chattahoochee River. With all the surrounding timber, it's beautiful, and the fresh air is just fantastic on the lungs. We decide after a while of hanging out at the river to hike in further like we usually do. I like to lead the way, and this time was no exception. I led the way with my friends, about 50 yards behind me. Generally, I like to scout out the area ahead, just to look for cool things to check out. Before, there's been trails, markings, animal tracks, bones, anything that's interesting that I deem worth stopping for. This time, though, I would run into something that I've had a hard time dealing with. I've actually had to seek a therapist for what I saw, just to try and convince myself that I'm not crazy, that I did indeed see an animal that isn't supposed to exist. For some of us, when you see something like that, it shatters your realm of reality. Anyway, I was walking further ahead of my friends, and I noticed a small clearing that dipped down. I figured we would cross the clearing and continue on venturing on. But as I approached the clearing, I saw at the bottom of the hill looked to be a large animal eating a dead deer. I stopped in my tracks at first, thinking it was a large bear eating on the carcass. Right off the bat, though, something about the animal just seemed off. It didn't look right. Where I was standing, I could only really see it from behind, and it had a weird shape to it. I know we have sizable black bear down here, and that's what popped in my head at first. After not even 10 seconds, this thing must have noticed me being around, because it stopped eating and lifted its head in the air and began sniffing, just like how a dog would. To my horror, that's when I saw more details. The longer snout, the pointier ears. It shifted its body as it lifted its head up, so I was able to see more details of the body. This thing looked like a giant dark gray wolf that looked, well, mutated. I don't know how else to describe it other than that. It really freaked me out. My friends came up behind me, wondering why I was standing still and silent. Without breaking eye contact with this thing sniffing, I quickly motioned for them to look out into the clearing. Both of my friends gasping, and my one buddy saying, "What the hell is that thing?" After After what seemed like minutes of this thing sniffing the air, even though it was probably only 10 seconds, I said, "Guys, we need to turn around and leave." We all left the area, and I wasn't going to chance sticking around and having this thing notice us. I'm blown away that this thing probably caught our scent, but either A, never saw us, or B, knew we were there and realized we weren't a threat. I'm really not sure. I was roughly about 100 to 200 yards away if I had to guess. What I saw looked like a giant black mace that looked more canine than anything. I've seen black bear many times, and this thing didn't quite look like a black bear. It was lighter in color and bigger. Plus, the shape was just different, especially as it started moving its body.